On Easter Sunday in the year 1722, a Dutch expedition working its way west across the Pacific sighted land where no land was supposed to be. They had been sailing for weeks through open water. The kind of emptiness that is difficult to convey. A quarter of the surface of the planet with nothing in it, no coastlines, no shipping, no birds for days at a stretch. And what rose out of that emptiness was a small triangular island of volcanic rock, perhaps 24 kilometers across at its widest, with green slopes and a long swell breaking, white against black cliffs. That alone would have been remarkable. What made the Dutch sailors stare, and what has held the world's attention for 3 centuries since, was what was standing on it. Along the coast, on great stone platforms facing inland, stood rows of enormous human figures carved from volcanic rock. Some were 4 meters high, some were more. They had long faces and heavy brows and elongated ears and hands folded low across their stomachs, and they stood with their backs to the sea, looking in toward the island in silent ranks, watching. There were hundreds of them, and around them, on an island that was almost bare of trees, lived a population of a few thousand people who had no metal, no wheels, no draft animals, and no boats capable of taking them anywhere at all. Hello, traveller. Tonight, we set out on the entire story of Easter Island, the most isolated inhabited place on the face of the earth, the giants, its people carved and raised, and eventually pulled down, and the 3 great questions that have never been fully answered about any of it. Before we begin, take a moment. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel, but only if these journeys are truly yours. And leave a word below to say where you're listening from tonight and the hour it is where you are. There's a quiet pleasure in seeing who else has gathered here tonight, in how many countries, under how many skies. Now, let the lights go low, let the world go quiet, and let's step into the story together. The Europeans who came after the Dutch could not make sense of it, and the sense they eventually settled on was wrong in almost every particular. Here was an island so remote that the nearest inhabited land lay 2,000 kilometers away over open ocean, holding a monument-building tradition of a scale that seemed to belong to Egypt rather than to a speck of rock in the Pacific, maintained by a small population living in what the visitors read as poverty. The conclusion drawn, again and again, over 200 years, was that the people found on the island could not possibly have made the statues. Someone else must have. A lost race, a vanished civilization, refugees from a sunken continent, wanderers from South America, visitors from somewhere further away still. Every one of these theories has been seriously proposed, and several of them are still in circulation on the internet tonight, and every one of them rests on the same unexamined assumption, that the Polynesians standing in front of the statues could not have been the ones who built them. They were. That is not in dispute among anyone who has actually studied the evidence. The archaeology, the linguistics, the oral tradition, and the genetics all say the same thing without ambiguity. The moai were carved by the ancestors of the people who were there to meet the Dutch, a Polynesian people who call themselves Rapa Nui and who call their island by the same name. The mystery of Easter Island was never who made the statues. It was, and remains, 3 much better questions. The first is how anyone got there at all. Pick up a globe and find the island. It is genuinely hard to locate, a dot in the eastern Pacific with thousands of kilometers of nothing in every direction. It was reached, deliberately, in open canoes, by people navigating without instruments, in what is one of the most extraordinary feats of exploration our species has ever performed. A voyage whose difficulty is best appreciated by noting that Rapa Nui is upwind of everywhere, meaning the canoe that found it was sailing against the prevailing weather for weeks, on purpose, into an ocean where the target was a triangle of land you could walk across in a day, invisible until you were within perhaps 60 kilometers of it, and one that European sailors of the 18th century, with their charts and compasses and vast ships, found almost impossible to credit. The second is how they moved the statues. There are nearly 1,000 of them on the island. They were carved in a single quarry in the flank of a volcano and then transported, some of them many kilometers, over broken volcanic ground to platforms on the coast. The largest ever raised weighs in the neighborhood of 80 tons. There were no wheels on the island, no draft animals, no metal tools of any kind, and by the time the statues were being moved in their greatest numbers, a landscape that was rapidly running out of large trees. The Rapa Nui themselves, asked how it was done, have always given the same answer, which sounds like folklore and which recent experiments have made look considerably less like folklore than anyone expected. The statues walked. And the third question is what happened to them. And this is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because you have almost certainly heard an answer to it already. Easter Island has become, over the last 50 years, the world's favourite parable. The island where a people cut down every tree, destroyed their own environment, collapsed into famine and warfare, and left nothing behind but silent statues as a warning to the rest of us. It is a powerful story. It has been told in best-selling books and documentaries and school curricula, and it is very probably wrong in its most important claims, and the people it is told about are still living on that island and have been objecting to it for a long time. Tonight, we are going to take all three questions seriously, in order, and give the honest state of the evidence on each. We will cross the Pacific with the navigators. We will stand in the quarry where 400 unfinished statues are still lying in the rock exactly where the carvers left them. We will look at the ropes and the experiments and the roads, and at the pollen cores and the rat bones and the population estimates, and at the ships that arrived in 1862 and took away a third of the island's people in a week. And at the end of it, we will be able to say, with reasonable confidence, what the island actually teaches, which is not the lesson that everyone thinks it teaches, and which is in some ways sadder and in other ways far more admirable. The isolation of Easter Island is the first fact about it and the hardest one to feel, because the numbers slide off the mind. So it is worth slowing down and building the distance properly, piece by piece, until it sits in the body rather than on the page. The island lies in the southeastern Pacific, roughly 27 degrees south of the equator. Its nearest inhabited neighbour is a tiny place called Pitcairn, famous for one thing, as the island where the mutineers of the Bounty hid themselves precisely because nobody would ever find them there. And Pitcairn is about 2,000 kilometres away. 2,000 kilometres of open ocean to reach the nearest people, and those people are a few dozen souls on another speck of rock. To reach a continent, you must go further still. The coast of Chile is roughly 3,500 kilometres to the east. In the other direction, the great island chains of central Polynesia lie thousands of kilometres to the west. Try converting that into something familiar. 2,000 kilometres is roughly the distance from London to the middle of Turkey, or from New York to the middle of Texas. Except that instead of countries and roads and coastlines, there is nothing at all in between. No land, no landmark, no shallow water, nothing but ocean in every direction to the horizon, day after day, for as long as it takes. And that is only to reach Pitcairn. The Rapa Nui, for most of their history, had no contact with any other human beings whatsoever. Not infrequent contact. None. This is why the island is routinely described as the most remote inhabited place on Earth, and the claim survives most attempts to qualify it. There are islands further from a continent, but they are either uninhabited or were settled from somewhere close. There is nowhere else where a permanent human society developed in such total separation for so long. It is worth putting a number on what that separation meant in practice. If a person on Rapa Nui in the year 1500 had wanted to see a human being who was not from their island, the journey would have required crossing 2,000 kilometres of open ocean in a canoe. And by 1500, the island no longer had trees large enough to build such a canoe. So the isolation was not merely geographic. At some point it became physical and absolute. The Rapa Nui could see the horizon in every direction and knew, correctly, that there was probably something out there, because their own oral traditions remembered arriving from somewhere. But they could not go and look. For perhaps 300 years before the Dutch arrived, the entire accessible universe of every person alive on that island was a triangle of land you could walk across in a day. Everything they knew about the wider world came from oral tradition. The memory of an ancestral homeland called Hiva, from which the founder Hotu Matua was said to have come, and the names and stories carried in the genealogies. That homeland was real. It lay somewhere to the west in the Marquesas or thereabouts. But no one alive had seen it. No one could go there. And after enough generations, the difference between a real place you cannot reach and a mythic one becomes very thin indeed. For something like 1,000 years, the entire human world, as far as anyone on Rapa Nui could know or verify, consisted of one triangular island 24 kilometers across and the people standing on it. Hold that thought for a moment, because it changes how everything else in this story should be read. Every person on that island knew every other person, or at least knew of them. There was one language, one set of ancestors, one shared history, and no possibility of leaving. There were no neighbors to trade with, no other societies to compare yourself to, nowhere to migrate when things went badly, and no outside help of any kind, ever. Whatever the Rapa Nui needed, they had to find on that island or make from what was on it. Whatever they built with what was there. Whatever went wrong, they had to solve where they stood. And in that closed world, with no metal and no wheels and no animals bigger than a chicken, a population that probably never much exceeded a few thousand people carved nearly 1,000 monumental statues out of a volcano and moved them across the landscape and stood them up on stone platforms facing their villages. Think about what that ratio implies for daily life. If there were, say, 3,000 people on the island and 900 statues were produced over 4 or 5 centuries, then virtually every family on Rapa Nui was connected to the enterprise. As carvers, as rope makers, as food producers releasing surplus to feed the crews, as haulers on the transport teams, as builders of platforms. The statues were not a royal project imposed from above on an indifferent population. On an island that small, monument building of that scale is simply what everybody did, the way everybody in a medieval European town was in some fashion connected to the cathedral. It is, measured against available resources, one of the most disproportionate monumental efforts in the history of the species. Run the comparison properly, and it becomes stranger still. The Great Pyramid was built by a kingdom of several million people, drawing on the annual flood of the most reliable river in the world, with copper tools, draft animals, boats capable of moving stone by water, and a centralized state that could requisition labor from an entire country. Stonehenge was raised by a population with access to a whole continent's worth of neighbors, materials, and reinforcements. The Rapa Nui had 160 square kilometers of windswept volcanic rock, no metal of any kind, no animal larger than a chicken, no navigable river, no trading partners, no possibility of outside labor, and, for most of the statue-building period, a population that would fit comfortably into a modern village. And they produced a monumental tradition that would be recognized as serious anywhere in the ancient world. Egypt built pyramids with the wealth of the Nile and a kingdom of millions. Rapa Nui built comparable ambition out of a rock in the middle of nowhere with a few thousand pairs of hands. Before the story proper begins, let us set out the 3 questions plainly and be honest about what can and cannot be answered. Because the honest version is more interesting than the confident one, and because on this particular subject, the confident version has done real damage. The first question is arrival. How did human beings find, and deliberately reach, a small island in the middle of the largest empty space on the planet? This one, remarkably, is now largely answered, and the answer is one of the great stories of human achievement. They found it because they were the finest open-ocean navigators the world has ever produced, and because they were looking. We will spend real time on how that was done, because it deserves it, and because for 2 centuries Europeans refused to believe it. The second question is the statues, how they were carved, how they were moved, and why. The carving we understand well. The quarry is still there, mid-work, with the tools lying about. The moving is the famous puzzle, and there are now 2 serious competing explanations, one of which matches the islanders' own oral tradition so precisely that it has forced a general reconsideration. The why is the hardest, as it always is. We can say what the statues meant in general terms, because Polynesian ancestor cults are well understood, but we cannot know what any individual carver was thinking. The third question is the ending, and this is where honesty matters most. The popular account holds that the Rapa Nui destroyed their own island through overexploitation and collapsed into starvation and violence before Europeans ever arrived. That story became enormously influential. It is probably the single most widely known thing about the island. And over the past 2 decades, a substantial body of archaeological work has challenged nearly every element of it. Not everyone accepts the revision, and the argument is live and sometimes heated. What is not in dispute is that catastrophic population loss on Rapa Nui happened after European contact, and that the largest single cause was not ecological at all, but human and external. So there will be no tidy verdict tonight on some of this, and that is the point rather than a failure. What we can do is lay out the evidence carefully, mark clearly where the ground is firm and where it is soft, and let the island keep the parts of its story that it has not yet given up. And it is worth saying at the outset, because it shapes everything. Rapa Nui is not a dead civilization. It is not Pompeii or Angkor. The distinction matters practically, not just morally. When we discuss the Sumerians, there is nobody alive who identifies as Sumerian and no community with a stake in how the account comes out. Rapa Nui is not like that. Every claim made about the island's past is a claim about somebody's great-great-grandparents, made in front of them, usually by outsiders, usually in languages they did not choose. It also means the community holds knowledge that no excavation can produce. Oral tradition on Rapa Nui preserved the fact that the statues walked, which the outside world dismissed for 2 centuries and then confirmed experimentally. It preserves the names of lineages, the associations of particular platforms with particular families, and accounts of events that archaeology can sometimes test and sometimes cannot. A discipline that treats the island purely as a site and its people purely as a modern population living on top of one is throwing away evidence. There are several thousand Rapa Nui people living on that island right now, speaking their language, restoring their ancestors' statues, and arguing, with good reason, about how their history gets told by everyone else. This is a story with living descendants, and it should be told as one. Begin with the ground, because on an island, this isolated the ground determines everything. Rapa Nui is volcanic and young by geological standards, under 1 million years old at the surface, which by the standards of continents is practically new construction, built up from the seafloor by 3 principal volcanoes whose cones still define the shape of the place. Teravaka rises at the northern end, the tallest point, its long slopes making up most of the island's bulk. Poiki stands at the eastern corner, older and more weathered. Rano Raraku occupies the southwest, and its crater is the single most spectacular feature on the island, an enormous bowl more than 1 kilometer across, dropping steeply to a lake far below, the water broken into a mosaic of green reed mats. And those reeds were themselves a resource, the totora that the Rapa Nui used for thatch, for matting, for the floating bundles the birdman swimmers rode, and for a dozen other purposes on an island desperately short of flexible material, with one wall of the crater eroded away so that from the rim you look straight out over a gap into the open Pacific. The triangle formed by these 3 volcanoes encloses a landscape of rolling grassland and lava fields, cinder cones, and a coastline that is mostly cliff. And here the difficulties begin. Rapa Nui has almost no beaches, a couple of small sandy coves at the northern end, and elsewhere black rock and surf. It has no protective coral reef, which means no calm lagoon, no reef fishery, and heavy ocean swell hitting the shore directly. It has no permanent rivers or streams because the porous volcanic rock swallows rainfall almost as fast as it lands. Fresh water collects in the crater lakes and in seeps at the shore, and gathering it was a permanent preoccupation. The solutions the Rapa Nui developed for that were ingenious and long overlooked. Along parts of the coast, fresh groundwater percolates through the porous rock and emerges at or below the tide line, mixing with the sea. And the islanders learned to dig and wall small basins at these coastal seeps to capture the fresher water as it surfaced, drinking it brackish. Early European visitors watched them do this and were baffled, some concluding that the islanders drank seawater, a claim that entered the literature and stayed there a long time. They were not drinking seawater. They were exploiting a subtle hydrological feature of their island using a technique that must have taken generations of observation to work out, and the remains of those water management structures are still visible along the shore. The soil is volcanic and can be productive, but the island sits far enough south to be cooler than most of tropical Polynesia, and the wind comes off the ocean constantly, drying and scouring everything exposed. So the settlers who arrived here were not landing in an easy paradise. They were landing on a small, windswept, riverless island with a difficult coastline at the far cold edge of the Polynesian world, where several of the crops their culture depended on would struggle, and where the reef fishing that fed most Pacific communities did not exist. What they did have was rock, extraordinary rock, in useful varieties. There was basalt, hard and dense, for tools and for building. There was obsidian from one of the cones, volcanic glass that flakes to a razor edge. And in the crater of a secondary cone called Rano Raraku, there was something more unusual. A thick deposit of volcanic tuff, compacted ash, soft enough to be carved with stone tools and hard enough to stand for centuries in the weather. That last fact is not a small detail. It is arguably the reason this entire story exists. Most Polynesian societies built monuments, great stone platforms, temple enclosures, carved wooden figures, because ancestor veneration and competitive display run right through the culture. What Rapa Nui had that others did not was a mountain of workable stone that a person with a handheld basalt pick could actually shape into a human figure 4 or 5 meters tall. Give that material to a Polynesian society with a strong ancestor cult and a few centuries of relative peace, and you get Rano Raraku, a volcano hollowed out from the inside by human hands, and 1,000 ancestors standing on the coast. It is worth adding what else the island's geology provided, because the Rapa Nui used all of it with precision. Red scoria from Punapau, light and porous, and a deep rust color for the topknots. Hard, fine-grained basalt from several sources for the toki picks, for the fitted masonry of the platforms, and for a small number of moai carved in the difficult stone rather than the easy tuff. Obsidian from Arito, black volcanic glass that flakes to an edge sharper than surgical steel for cutting tools and drills. Water-rounded beach cobbles, carried up from the shore, for paving the ceremonial plazas and edging the platforms. Coral from the reef-poor coast, gathered and ground and polished for the whites of the eyes. Every one of those materials comes from a different place on a small island, and every one is used for exactly the job its properties suit. That is a society with a detailed working knowledge of its own geology, developed by experiment over centuries. To understand how anyone reached Rapa Nui, you have to understand what the Polynesians actually accomplished across the Pacific, because it is arguably the greatest sustained feat of exploration in the history of our species, and because for 200 years Europeans went to enormous intellectual trouble to avoid believing it. Look at the Pacific on a map. It covers about 1/3 of the surface of the Earth, larger than every landmass on the planet combined. Scattered across that immensity are islands, most of them small, separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers of open water. Over a period of roughly 3,000 years, a seafaring people spread out of Ireland, Southeast Asia, and settled essentially all of them. They found and colonized Fiji, Samoa, Tonga. Then, in a later burst of expansion, they pushed into the remote eastern Pacific and found the Society Islands, the Marquesas, the Cooks, the Australs. The timing of that later burst is itself remarkable. After the settlement of Western Polynesia, there appears to have been a long pause, centuries during which the frontier did not move. And then, beginning around 1,000 years ago, an explosive expansion that carried people across the whole remaining Eastern Pacific within a few generations. Archaeologists call it the pulse, and its speed is startling. Island group after island group settled in rapid succession, thousands of kilometers of ocean crossed, until every habitable speck from Hawaii to New Zealand to Rapa Nui had people on it. Something changed to make that possible. Improved canoe design, a favorable climatic window, a cultural shift toward exploration, or all three together. And the result was the largest and fastest maritime colonization in human history, completed before Europe had ships that would leave the sight of land willingly. From that eastern base, they reached out to the 3 far corners of the enormous triangle that we now call Polynesia, north to Hawaii, thousands of kilometers across the equator, southwest to New Zealand, the largest and coldest of all, and east to Rapa Nui, the loneliest. They did this without instruments. No compass, no sextant, no chronometer, no charts. They did it in double-hulled sailing canoes built with stone and shell tools and lashed together with cordage made from coconut fiber. Vessels that were fast, seaworthy, capable of carrying dozens of people, along with the plants and animals needed to found a colony, and able to sail into the wind, which mattered enormously, and which we will come back to. And they did it before the Vikings reached Iceland, before European ships would leave sight of land willingly, in an ocean where a navigational error of a few degrees over 1,000 kilometers means missing your destination entirely and dying of thirst. For a long time, the European response to this was disbelief, sometimes explicit and sometimes buried in polite theory. Captain Cook, to his credit, understood immediately what he was looking at. He noted with astonishment that people speaking recognizably related languages occupied islands scattered across a quarter of the globe, and he grasped that this implied deliberate voyaging on a scale beyond anything Europe had attempted. But the theory that dominated for much of the 20th century held that Polynesian settlement was essentially accidental. Fishermen blown off course, canoes drifting on currents, castaways washing up and surviving. It was a comfortable idea, and it was tested in the 1970s by computer simulation of Pacific winds and currents, and the results were decisive. Drift voyaging cannot account for the settlement pattern. You cannot drift from central Polynesia to Hawaii, or to New Zealand, or to Rapa Nui. The winds and currents do not do that. Those islands were reached by people sailing deliberately, upwind, looking for them. And then, in 1976, the argument was settled in the most direct way imaginable. A group in Hawaii built a traditional double-hulled voyaging canoe, named it Hokunal, and sailed it from Hawaii to Tahiti, a distance of some 4,000 kilometers, with no instruments of any kind, navigated by a man named Mau Pialug from the tiny island of Satawal in Micronesia, one of the last people alive who had been trained in traditional wayfinding from childhood. They made landfall. They have made many voyages since, all over the Pacific, including a full circumnavigation of the globe. The question of whether Polynesians could navigate deliberately across thousands of kilometers of open ocean is no longer an academic question. It has been demonstrated repeatedly, in public, by their descendants. So how is it actually done? The technique is called wayfinding, and understanding even its outline changes how you see that island sitting alone in the eastern Pacific. The foundation is the sky. A trained navigator holds in memory the rising and setting points of a large number of stars on the horizon. A mental compass of perhaps 32 directional points, each marked by particular stars that rise at that bearing. Stars rise and set through the night, so the navigator does not follow one star. They follow a sequence, switching to the next as each climbs too high to be useful, holding the canoe on a bearing through the whole night by a rolling succession of horizon stars. By day, the sun's rising and setting positions serve, adjusted by season, along with the angle of the swell against the hull. That last one is the piece that most surprises people. The ocean carries long, regular swells generated by distant weather systems, and these hold their direction with great consistency over enormous distances, far more reliably than the local wind waves that sit on top of them. A skilled navigator learns to feel the pattern of swells through the motion of the canoe, in the body rather than the eye, and can hold a course by that pattern even under complete overcast, at night, with no sky at all. Traditional Marshall Islands navigators built lattice stick charts to teach the interference patterns of swells around islands. It is a genuinely different way of knowing where you are, and it works. There is a detail from the ethnographic record that conveys how deep this went. Navigators in some Pacific traditions would lie down in the hull of the canoe, in the most sensitive part of the vessel, and read the sea through the small of the back, because the body can distinguish the interaction of 2 or 3 swell trains running at different angles more reliably than the eye can distinguish anything at all in open water at night. The instrument was the navigator. Training began in childhood and continued for decades, and the whole system. The star compass, the swell library, the bird behavior, the cloud reading, the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of islands and the routes between them, existed entirely in memory, with no writing of any kind, and was passed by chant and by apprenticeship from one person to another for 1,000 years. Some traditions encoded portions of it in song, so that a chant recited in sequence would name the stars and the bearings for a particular route in the correct order. A sailing direction memorized as music. Others used physical teaching aids, arrangements of coral or stones laid out on the ground as a star compass for instruction, with an apprentice sitting in the middle and naming the points until they were automatic. Then there is the business of finding an island once you are near it, which extends your target enormously. An island a few kilometers across is nearly impossible to hit exactly across 1,000 kilometers of ocean, but an island is surrounded by a halo of signs that can be read from far off. Seabirds that roost on land and fish at sea fly out in the morning and back at evening, so their direction at dusk points to land, sometimes 50 or more kilometers away. Certain cloud formations pile up over islands and stand still while other clouds move. The underside of a cloud over a lagoon can take a greenish tint. Floating vegetation, particular fish, changes in the swell pattern where it refracts and reflects around an unseen landmass. All of it read together turns a pinpoint target into a broad zone. A navigator aiming for a single island might treat it as a target 30 or 40 kilometers wide once the halo of signs is included, and would often deliberately aim off to one side, so that on making landfall signs they would know with certainty which way to turn. A technique used by sailors everywhere who navigate without precise position, because an error of unknown direction is far worse than a known error. And there is one more piece, the most important strategically. The prevailing winds in the tropical Pacific blow from the east. This means that sailing eastward, into the wind, is difficult, and sailing home westward is easy. Polynesian exploration appears to have exploited this deliberately. You probe eastward against the wind, which is slow and hard, and if you find nothing, you turn and run home before the wind, quickly and safely. It is the design of a search strategy with a built-in return, and it explains how a culture could conduct exploratory voyaging for centuries without simply losing everyone who tried. And there was a second safety feature built into the pattern of Pacific weather. The trade winds are reliable most of the year, but they reverse periodically during westerly wind episodes associated with the climate oscillation we now call El Niño, meaning that at intervals the prevailing wind blows the wrong way, eastward, for days or weeks at a time. A voyaging culture that understood this could wait for such a window and then run east with the wind behind them, covering enormous distances quickly and safely rather than beating painfully upwind. Several researchers have argued that the great eastward expansions of Polynesia, including the settlement of Rapa Nui, cluster in periods when such conditions were more frequent. If so, the picture becomes even more impressive. Not just deliberate exploration, but exploration timed to exploit a climatic pattern that no one would formally describe for another 800 years. The eastward expansion of Polynesia, all the way out to Rapa Nui, was not a series of lucky accidents. It was a systematic, generations-long program of upwind exploration by people who had worked out how to look for land without dying in the attempt. At some point, one of those probing canoes came over the horizon and saw a small triangular island with 3 volcanic cones, ringed by cliffs and surf, with no other land in any direction. Nobody knows who they were or what they called the moment. But we can say a surprising amount about what happened next. The date has been argued over for decades, and has been moving in one direction. Older estimates put settlement as early as the 4th or 5th century AD, based on a handful of radiocarbon dates that later proved unreliable. Careful redating, using only samples where the relationship between the dated material and human activity is secure, has pulled the arrival much later. Most current work places the founding somewhere around 1200 AD, give or take, with some arguing for a century or so earlier. That matters enormously for the rest of the story, because it compresses everything. If people arrived around 1200 and the first Europeans came in 1722, then the entire moai building civilization, the quarrying, the carving, the transport, the platforms, nearly 1,000 statues, was built inside about 500 years, possibly less. The founding group was probably small. Genetic and archaeological reasoning suggests a founding population in the range of a few dozen people arriving in 1 or 2 canoes, which is the normal pattern for Polynesian colonization, a viable settlement party with enough people to reproduce and enough hands to establish crops. They brought their world with them, as Polynesian colonists always did. The list is not improvised. It is a standard colonizing kit refined over centuries of island settlement, carried deliberately because the founders knew they were going somewhere that would have none of it. Every plant on that canoe had to survive weeks of salt spray and then establish in unknown soil, which is why they were carried as cuttings and tubers packed in damp material rather than as seed. A Polynesian settlement voyage was, among other things, an agricultural expedition. Chickens, which became the island's main source of protein on land. The Polynesian rat, which came along on every canoe, sometimes as a food source and always as a stowaway, and which will turn out to matter a great deal. And plants, taro, yams, bananas, sugarcane, the paper mulberry whose bark makes cloth, and the sweet potato, which does not belong in this list at all, and which we will deal with next, because it is a genuine anomaly. They arrived on an island that was, at that moment, entirely different from the one the Dutch would see 5 centuries later. The pollen record is unambiguous. Rapa Nui was forested. How that record is read is worth a sentence, because it is one of the more elegant techniques in environmental archaeology. Pollen grains are tough, distinctive by species, and settle continuously into the sediment of standing water. Take a core from the bottom of a crater lake, and you have a stratified column in which every centimeter of mud holds the pollen rain of a particular span of years. Date the layers with radiocarbon, and you can read the vegetation of the surrounding landscape century by century, like a bar chart drawn by the island itself. 3 such crater lakes exist on Rapa Nui, and cores from all of them tell the same story. A great palm, related to the Chilean wine palm and now extinct, covered much of the island, along with other trees and shrubs. A subtropical woodland running up the volcanic slopes. There were nesting seabirds in enormous numbers, colonies of them, in a place that had never had a land predator. There were fish and shellfish along the coast, though fewer than a Polynesian settler would have expected, and this is another of the island's quiet difficulties. Rapa Nui has no coral reef, and a reef is where the great majority of the food in a tropical Pacific island system lives. The shallow, warm, sheltered nursery that supports the reef fish, the octopus, the shellfish, the whole inshore economy that fed most Polynesian communities. Without one, the island's marine resources were thin. Deep water fishing from canoes for tuna and porpoise, some shellfish on the rocks, and not much else. It is one more reason the Rapa Nui ended up depending so heavily on what they could grow and on their chickens, and it explains the hair mower, the stone chicken houses, in a new light. On an island with no reef, poultry was not a supplement but a strategic protein reserve, and the elaborate stone structures built to protect the birds at night. Walls thick enough to be genuinely defensive, entrances small enough to be blocked with a single stone. Makes sense as the safeguarding of something the community could not afford to lose. To the small group stepping out of a canoe after weeks at sea, it must have looked extraordinarily promising. An untouched, uninhabited, forested island, with birds so unafraid that they could be taken by hand. Within a few centuries, most of that would be gone. How and why is the argument at the heart of this story, and we will come to it properly. But it is worth fixing this first morning in mind before anything else happens. An island covered in palms, loud with seabirds, and a few dozen people standing on the shore, the only human beings within 2,000 kilometers, looking at a place that no one had ever seen before. There is a question that the story of the arrival raises and rarely answers. Polynesian voyaging was a two-way system. You sailed out, and if you found nothing, you came home, and if you found something, you often went back to tell people and returned with more settlers, plants, and animals. Island groups across the Pacific show exactly this pattern. Repeated contact between neighboring archipelagos for generations after first settlement, with goods and people and stone tools moving back and forth along known routes. Rapa Nui does not show it. The contrast with other island groups is stark. In Hawaii, oral tradition remembers named voyages back and forth to Tahiti over generations, and archaeology finds imported stone from other archipelagos in Hawaiian sites. In the Cooks and the Societies, adzes made of stone from one island turn up on another hundreds of kilometers away, tracing regular traffic. That is what a connected Polynesian world looks like in the ground. The archaeological record indicates that after the founding voyage or voyages, contact with the rest of Polynesia effectively ceased. No imported stone from other island groups appears in later layers. No new crops or animals arrive. The language drifts on its own line, developing in isolation. Whatever happened, the island was settled and then, in practical terms, cut off. The genetic evidence supports the same picture. The modern Rapa Nui population shows the signature of a small founding group followed by long isolation, exactly what you would expect from 1 or 2 canoes arriving and nothing arriving afterward. Why? Distance is the obvious answer, and it is probably most of it. Rapa Nui is simply too far upwind of everywhere else for regular contact to be worth the risk, and finding it again from the west would have required extraordinary luck or extraordinary navigation. But there is a second factor that becomes decisive with time: the trees. Building an ocean-going double-hulled voyaging canoe requires large timber, and quite a lot of it, along with fibre for cordage and bark for sails. As the palms failed, the island lost the capacity to build such a vessel. By the time the Dutch arrived, the Rapa Nui were putting to sea in small patched craft made of many pieces of driftwood sewn together, which the Dutch described with something close to pity. So the isolation deepened in stages. First, they were far away. Then they were far away and could not build the boats. And what that means, if you follow it through, is that at some point in the island's history there was a last canoe capable of crossing open ocean, and a last person who knew how to navigate one, and neither of those facts would have been marked at the time. Somebody made the final voyaging canoe on Rapa Nui and did not know it was the last. Somebody was the final navigator on that island who could have found Pitcairn, and died an old man, and the knowledge went with him, and the island's horizon closed. There is a version of that moment in every culture's history, and it is almost never recorded, because a last time does not announce itself. The last person who could read rongorongo did not know they were the last. The last carver at Rano Raraku put down a basalt pick at the end of an ordinary afternoon, expecting to pick it up again. That is one of the quieter tragedies in this story, and it is easy to miss beside the statues and the raids. And it has a strange resonance with what happened to the wider Polynesian navigational tradition 4 centuries later. Knowledge that existed only in living minds, allowed to lapse, 1 generation from gone. On Rapa Nui, the loss was complete and permanent, because there was no mau piailug on a neighbouring island to bring it back. There was no neighbouring island. What went out of use there went out of existence. A people who were among the greatest sailors in human history settled the loneliest island on Earth, and then, over a few centuries, lost the ability to leave it. When Europeans arrived with their enormous ships, they were meeting the descendants of navigators who could no longer go anywhere, which is part of why the encounter went the way it did. There is one item on the list of plants the Polynesians carried that should not be there, and it has generated a century of argument that is still not entirely settled. The sweet potato is American. It was domesticated in the Andean region of South America, and it has no wild ancestors anywhere in the Pacific. And yet when Europeans arrived in Polynesia, the sweet potato was already there, growing across an enormous swathe of the eastern Pacific, and it was not a minor curiosity. In some places, including New Zealand and Rapa Nui, it had become a staple crop, central to survival. It got there before European ships did. Somebody carried it across thousands of kilometers of open ocean from South America to Polynesia, or from Polynesia to South America and back. And there is a second piece of evidence that makes it harder to dismiss: the word. In many Polynesian languages, the sweet potato is called kumara, or something very close to it. In Quechua, the language of the Andes, one of the words for sweet potato is kumar. A plant and its name traveling together is exactly what you would expect from human contact, and exactly what you would not expect from a stray seed floating on a current. 3 explanations have been proposed, and it is worth being fair to each. The first is that Polynesians sailed to South America and came back. Given what we now know about their navigational capability, given Hokulea, given the settlement of the entire Pacific Triangle, this is entirely within their demonstrated range. From Rapa Nui, the coast of Chile is closer than many of the voyages they routinely made. A canoe reaching the mainland, staying long enough to acquire a useful crop and its name, and then sailing home upwind is difficult but not remotely impossible for people who found Rapa Nui in the first place. The second is that South Americans sailed west. This was the theory of Thor Heyerdahl, who in 1947 built a balsa raft called Kon-Tiki and sailed it from Peru into the Pacific to demonstrate that it could be done, and who argued that Rapa Nui had been settled from South America. He was a genuine adventurer, and his voyage was a real feat, and his central thesis is now firmly rejected. The language, the archaeology, the crops, the tools, the physical anthropology, and above all the genetics all point overwhelmingly to a Polynesian origin for the Rapa Nui. Heyerdahl reached the Pacific on a raft. The evidence did not follow him. The third is natural dispersal, that a sweet potato or its seed floated or was carried by birds. This is not impossible, and some researchers have argued for it on genetic grounds, pointing to studies suggesting the plant's arrival in the Pacific may substantially predate human settlement there. But it leaves the word unexplained, and the word is stubborn. Where does that leave us? Genetic studies of modern Polynesian populations have detected a small but apparently real component of Native American ancestry in some eastern Polynesian groups, with statistical dating that points to contact some centuries before Europeans arrived. Other work disputes the timing or the interpretation. The most defensible position at present is that some contact between Polynesians and South America very probably occurred, and it is worth noting how well that fits everything else we know about these people. a culture that systematically probed upwind across the largest ocean on Earth, that found and settled every habitable island in a triangle the size of Eurasia, and that reached Rapa Nui, would have had the coast of South America within its demonstrated operational range from there. The distance from Rapa Nui to Chile is comparable to voyages Polynesians are known to have made repeatedly elsewhere. If anyone in the pre-modern world was going to cross that gap, it was them, most likely in the medieval centuries, most likely with Polynesians doing the sailing, and that it was a brief encounter rather than a migration, leaving a crop, a word, and a faint genetic trace, and changing nothing fundamental about who the Rapa Nui were. They were Polynesians who had, quite possibly, been to America and come home, which, if true, makes their achievement larger rather than smaller. We have crossed the Pacific now, and stood on the shore with the founding canoe. Before we go up to the quarry and the giants, the story pauses here, at the very beginning of the island's human history, on a morning before any of it has happened. It is early, and the light is coming up grey and then gold over an island that has no name yet. The sea is enormous and empty in every direction, moving in long, slow swells that have travelled thousands of kilometres without meeting anything and breaking white along the black rock at the foot of the cliffs. The sound of that surf is constant and will be constant for the whole of the island's history. There is nowhere on Rapa Nui out of earshot of the sea. Inland, the slopes are covered in palms, not scattered trees but woodland, running up the volcanic ground toward the cones, the great fronds lifting and turning in the wind that comes off the ocean and never quite stops. Beneath them, the ground is soft with fallen fronds and nuts. There are no paths. Nothing has ever walked here that needed one. And the birds. This is the thing hardest to picture now, because it is the most completely gone. The island is loud with them. The archaeological record of that first period is startling on this point. Excavations of the earliest occupation layers turn up bird bone in quantities and varieties that simply do not exist on the island now. At least 25 species of seabird breeding there, along with several land birds found nowhere else, all of it forming a substantial part of the settlers' diet in the first generations. Rapa Nui was, when people arrived, one of the great seabird breeding stations of the eastern Pacific. Within a few centuries, almost all of it was gone. The ground-nesting colonies could not survive people and rats together, and the birds withdrew to the offshore islets, which is precisely why the birdman ceremony later took place on a rock 1.5 kilometers offshore. The tern had to be reached by swimming, because the tern no longer nested where anyone could walk. The land birds fared worse still. At least 6 species that lived on Rapa Nui, and nowhere else, are known only from bones in the archaeological deposits, extinct before any naturalist ever saw one alive. We have their skeletons and scientific descriptions, and nothing else. No drawing, no account of their song, no record of what the Rapa Nui called them. Seabirds in colonies, petrels, shearwaters, terns, boobies, fregat birds, nesting on the ground and in the cliffs in numbers that have built up over hundreds of thousands of years on an island with no predator of any kind. They wheel out over the water in the morning in great scattered clouds and come back at evening, and the noise of them is the loudest thing on the island after the sea. They are not afraid. They have no reason to be. A person could walk up to a nesting bird and pick it up. That fearlessness is the standard condition of island fauna that has evolved without predators. And it is the standard reason such fauna disappears within a few generations of people arriving. It is not greed that does it. It is that an animal which has never needed to run does not run, and a colony that nests on open ground has no defense against anything that walks. The same story has played out on hundreds of islands. It played out here. Down at the shore, drawn up on one of the 2 small sandy coves, is a canoe. 2 hulls lashed together, worn from weeks at sea, the sail furled. A few dozen people are camped beside it. They have been here days, or perhaps weeks. They have brought their plants and their chickens ashore and begun to look at the ground and the water and the wind, working out where the fresh water collects, which slopes will take a garden, where the fish are. They are the only human beings within 2,000 kilometers, and they know it, and they are going to stay. There is a great quiet in that morning, and a great rest in it. Everything is still ahead. The villages, the platforms, the quarry, the 1,000 ancestors standing on the coast, and all the long argument about what came after. None of it has happened yet. This morning there is only an island covered in palms, a sea with nothing beyond it, the noise of birds, and a small group of people at the edge of the water at the far end of the greatest voyage anyone had ever made, looking at a place nobody had ever seen. Rest here a while, in that first light, before the work begins. Out on the water, the swell keeps coming in from the southwest, the way it has for as long as there has been an ocean here, and breaks along the black rock and draws back with that long dragging hiss over the stones. The palms move all together when the wind pushes through them and then settle. Somewhere up the slope, a bird calls and 100 answer. The smoke from the small fire at the camp goes up straight for a few meters and then bends away inland, and the light strengthens, and the whole island turns slowly from grey to green to gold as the sun comes up out of the emptiest ocean in the world. Now to the statues, and the first thing to do is correct the picture almost everyone carries, because the popular image of Easter Island is wrong in a way that changes the whole meaning of the place. They are not heads. The most famous photographs show a line of enormous stone faces protruding from a grassy slope, and generations have grown up believing that the moai are giant heads buried to the chin. They are not. They are complete figures. Head, torso, arms, hands. And the ones on that slope are standing upright in the ground with their bodies below the surface, buried over centuries by soil washing down the hill and by deliberate backfilling around statues that were standing in the quarry awaiting transport. Excavations have dug down alongside them and found the bodies. Long torsos, arms held tight to the sides, hands with elongated fingers meeting low across the abdomen, and on some, carved designs on the back, spirals and rings, and a broad belt-like motif at the waist. The complete statue is a standing human figure, and the ones on the coastal platforms show it plainly. The style is remarkably consistent. Heavy, angular brows, deep-set eye sockets, a long, straight nose, a small, firm mouth with the lower lip pushed slightly forward, a prominent chin, and long ears with extended lobes. The head is disproportionately large relative to the body, which is standard across Polynesian sculpture and reflects a wider cultural understanding that the head is the seat of a person's sacred power. They are not portraits in the modern sense, but they are not generic either. There is real variation in proportion and detail between statues, and the tradition clearly developed over time. And what they represent is not mysterious at all, which surprises people expecting an enigma. They are ancestors. Polynesian religion across the Pacific centers on the veneration of the lineage dead. Important ancestors do not depart entirely, but remain present, watching over and protecting their descendants, and carry a spiritual power called mana that flows through the family line and can be concentrated in objects, places, and images. The moai are representations of high-ranking ancestors, chiefs, founders of lineages, set up as a permanent presence over the community they belonged to. The Rapa Nui term for the concept is Orongo, living face. That is what a moai is called, the living face of the ancestor. It is not a memorial to someone absent. It is a presence, the person continuing in stone, positioned where the family can be seen and protected. Everything about the way the statues were treated follows from that. They were fed, in the sense that offerings were made at the platform. They were activated with eyes, and until then were not yet looking. And when a statue was pulled down, later, the way to end it was to break the neck and put the face into the ground, because if the power lies in the living face, then the face is what you must deal with, which explains the single most telling detail about how they were placed. The statues on the coastal platforms do not look out at the sea. They stand with their backs to the ocean and their faces turned inland toward the village. They were not watching for anything coming across the water. They were watching over their own people, which is exactly what an ancestor is supposed to do. Every time you see a photograph of moai standing on the shore, remember that the photographer is standing where the living were meant to stand, and that the statues are looking at the houses and the gardens and the children of the family that raised them. Which also means that almost every famous photograph of Easter Island is, in a sense, taken from the wrong side. The images that circulate show the moai in profile or from behind with the ocean beyond, because that is the dramatic composition. The view the statues were carved for is the one from the village, looking up at a line of ancestors standing above you with white coral eyes at the top of a stone platform with your own house behind you. Nobody photographs that because the village is gone. There is one famous exception, and it proves the rule beautifully. At Ahuakivi, inland from the coast, 7 moai stand in a line facing out toward the sea, the only statues on the island that look at the ocean. This has generated a great deal of romantic speculation about watchmen scanning the horizon for returning voyagers. The prosaic explanation is almost certainly correct. Ahuakivi sits inland, and the village it served lay between the platform and the water, so the statues are facing their community exactly like all the others. They are not looking at the sea. They are looking past it, at the houses that used to be in front of them. The rule never broke. The geography just moved. Nearly every moai on the island came out of one place, and that place is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites anywhere in the world. The concentration is itself worth noting. In most monument-building societies, quarrying is distributed. You take stone from wherever suitable stone occurs near where you need it. On Rapa Nui, essentially the entire output of a 5-century tradition came from a single cone, which means that every lineage on the island, however hostile to its neighbours, had to have access to the same hillside. Whatever the political arrangements were, they included some understanding that permitted crews from all over the island to quarry at Rano Raraku and to move their statues across other people's territory to reach the coast. That is a considerable amount of cooperation embedded in what is usually described as a competition. The transport roads point the same way. They radiate out from the quarry across the island, and a road that crosses several lineages' territory to reach a distant coast implies an accepted rite of passage. Whatever rivalries existed between the families of Rapa Nui, they operated inside a framework that everyone respected enough to let 90 tons of somebody else's ancestor walk through their land. Rano Raraku is a volcanic cone on the eastern side of the island, and its slopes and crater walls are made of consolidated volcanic ash, tough, that is soft enough to carve with hand-held stone tools and hard enough to endure for centuries once shaped. Roughly 95% of the island's statues were quarried here. Walk up the slope today and you are walking through a workshop that stopped mid-shift and was never cleaned up. There are something like 400 moai still at Rano Raraku in every conceivable state of completion. Some are barely outlines, blocked out in the rock face, the first channels cut around a shape that is going to become a face. Walking among them is a strange experience that visitors consistently describe in the same way. It does not feel like a ruin. Ruins are places where something finished has decayed. Rano Raraku is a place where something unfinished has simply stopped. The difference between a fallen building and a workshop where everyone has gone home. The tools are down, the work is half done, and the impression is less of antiquity than of interruption. Some of the carving beds still hold small piles of stone chips where they fell. In a few places you can see the last strokes made on a surface, individual tool marks, and follow the direction the carver was working in. The rock has held that information for 500 or 600 years and will hold it for a good deal longer. Some are almost finished but still attached to the bedrock along the spine, lying on their backs in their carving beds, waiting to be cut free. Some have been cut free and moved down the slope and stood upright in pits, apparently for finishing work on the back, and are still standing there. These are the famous buried figures whose heads show above the ground. And one, called Te Tokanga, the giant, lies unfinished in the rock face, 21 meters long, weighing something in the region of 200 tons. For comparison, the largest moai ever successfully raised on a platform is roughly 10 meters and around 80 tons, and moving that one was at the outer limit of what the island could do. Te Tokanga is more than twice its length and something like 2.5 times its mass. It lies on its back in the quarry with the rock of the slope still holding it, face finished, arms indicated, entirely complete as a piece of sculpture and entirely impossible as a monument. It was never going to be moved. Nobody knows whether the carvers believed it could be or whether the point was the carving itself. The tools are still there too, in the thousands. Handheld picks of hard basalt, called toki, pointed and heavy, worn down by use and discarded where they broke. There are no metal tools on Rapa Nui and never were. Every one of those statues was shaped by people holding a stone in their hands and striking the rock over and over for as long as it took. How long did it take? Experimental archaeology has produced estimates rather than certainties. A team of carvers working with replica toki on the actual tuff appears able to rough out and largely finish a mid-sized statue in something on the order of a year with a crew of a few men. Multiply that across nearly 1,000 statues over perhaps 4 or 5 centuries, and the arithmetic works out to a continuous, multi-generational industry. At any given moment for hundreds of years, somewhere on that slope, someone was carving an ancestor out of a volcano. The method is legible in the rock face. A statue was blocked out, lying on its back, face up, carved directly into the tuff of the slope. The front and sides fully finished, down to the fingers and the fine detail of the face, while the back remained attached to the bedrock along a keel of stone running the length of the spine. Only when the front was essentially complete was that keel cut through, freeing the statue, and this was the dangerous moment, an unsupported multi-ton figure on a slope. The freed moai was then lowered down the hillside, probably with ropes and prepared channels, and stood upright in a prepared pit where the back could finally be carved and where the statue waited for its journey. Every stage of that sequence is visible at Rano Raraku today because examples were abandoned at every stage. Fathers taught sons. Techniques developed. The statues got larger over time, which is what competitive monumental traditions everywhere tend to do. And then it stopped. Not gradually. The evidence at Rano Raraku suggests something closer to a halt, with work abandoned at every stage simultaneously, tools left lying, statues frozen half-emerged from the rock. Why the carving stopped is one of the real questions, and we will come back to it, because the popular answer and the current evidence do not entirely agree. Now the famous question. How do you move an 80-ton stone figure across kilometers of broken volcanic ground, without wheels, without draft animals, without metal, on an island where the large timber is running short? For most of the 20th century, the assumed answer was, you lay them down and drag them. Thor Heyerdahl, in the 1950s, had a team pull a moai on a wooden sledge, and it worked, and the image stuck. Hundreds of people hauling a prone statue on rollers or a sledge, consuming enormous quantities of rope and timber. This became a central pillar of the ecological collapse story. The idea that the island was deforested largely to provide the rollers and ropes for moving statues, that the Rapa Nui literally cut down their world to move their gods. There was always a problem with it, and the problem is that the Rapa Nui themselves have never said that is what happened. Their oral tradition is consistent and has been recorded since the earliest European inquiries. The moai walked. They went to their platforms upright, moving themselves, animated by mana. Europeans heard this for 200 years and filed it under mythology, because of course a stone statue cannot walk. Then, in 2011, 2 archaeologists, Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, took the tradition literally and tested it. The reasoning that led them there is worth following, because it is the evidence rather than the folklore that pointed the way. Statues found abandoned along the ancient transport roads have a distinctive shape. They lean forward, with a wide D-shaped base cut, so that the center of mass sits well forward of center. That geometry is unstable if you want to stand a statue up permanently. And in fact, the statues that reached their platforms had their bases recut flat and the forward lean corrected. Why would you carve a statue that cannot stand still and then modify it on arrival? Unless the shape was a transport design. Their experiment used a replica moai of about 5 tons, 3 teams of people, and ropes. 2 teams pulled from either side at the head, and a third steadied from behind. The ropes were tied around the head, high on the statue, which is where the leverage is. And the fact that the moai have that heavy, forward-projecting head and a narrow neck begins to look less like stylistic convention and more like engineering. A design that concentrates mass high and forward is exactly what a rocking walk requires. By pulling alternately, left and right, the statue rocked on its rounded forward base. And because it was leaning forward, each rock pivoted it a little further ahead. It walked, in a swiveling shuffle, exactly like moving a heavy refrigerator across a kitchen floor. 18 people moved at 100 meters in under an hour. The motion looks, in the footage, uncannily like an enormous person walking. And the detail that makes the experiment persuasive rather than merely charming is the base geometry, because that is a piece of physical evidence that existed long before anyone thought to test it. A statue designed to be dragged on its back needs no particular base shape at all. A statue designed to stand permanently needs a flat base and a balanced center of mass. The road statues have neither. They have a curved, D-shaped base and a pronounced forward lean that makes them tip over if you simply stand them up and let go. That is a deliberate carving choice, made in the quarry before transport, that serves no purpose except transport. And it is precisely the geometry a rocking, walking statue requires. The carvers were building the moving mechanism into the object, and the roads support it. The ancient transport routes have been mapped, and they are not simply flattened tracks. Some sections are slightly concave in cross-section, which would be a hazard for dragging a sledge and an advantage for keeping a rocking, walking statue centered. Statues abandoned along the roads tend to lie in a pattern consistent with tipping over while upright. Those on downhill stretches face one way, those on uphill stretches the other, which is what you would expect from a top-heavy walking object losing balance, and not obviously what you would expect from a sledge. Not everyone accepts it. Critics point out that a 5-ton replica is a long way from an 80-ton original, that the technique may not scale, and that some statues might well have been moved horizontally. Both methods may have been used for different statues in different periods, but the walking hypothesis has shifted the argument substantially, and it does something more important than solve a puzzle. It takes an indigenous oral tradition that Europeans dismissed as superstition for 2 centuries and demonstrates that it was an accurate technical description all along. The Rapa Nui had been telling everyone exactly how it was done. Nobody was listening. The statues were not the whole monument. They were the crowning element of something larger, and the something larger is in many ways more impressive. An ahu is a ceremonial stone platform, and there are hundreds of them around the coast of Rapa Nui. They belong to a Polynesian tradition found across the Pacific. The moai of Tahiti, the heiau of Hawaii. Sacred precincts, usually rectangular, marking the ritual center of a community and serving as the place where the living met the ancestral dead. On Rapa Nui, the form developed into something monumental. Long stone platforms, often raised several meters, faced with fitted basalt blocks, with a paved ramp on the landward side and burial chambers within the structure. The dead of the lineage were interred in the ahu. The statues of the lineage stood on top of it. The structures are more elaborate than a casual look suggests. A typical ahu has a rubble core faced with fitted stone, a broad paved ramp on the landward side, a levelled plaza in front where the community gathered, and often a line of carefully rounded beach stones laid along the seaward edge. Burial practice varied over time. Some individuals were interred in chambers within the platform, some placed in crematoria behind it, some added in later centuries after the statues had fallen, when ahu continued to serve as burial places long after they had stopped serving as pedestals. A single platform might have been built, extended, remodeled, and repurposed over 400 or 500 years. Which means the ahu are not monuments to a moment but accumulations, like the temple mounds of Mesopotamia, recording the whole history of a lineage in their masonry. Some of the masonry is superb. At Ahu Vinapu, the seaward retaining wall is built of large basalt blocks cut and fitted together with a precision that genuinely startles visitors. Flush joints, no mortar, subtly curved faces. It looks, to the untrained eye, remarkably like Inca stonework in Peru, and Heyerdahl seized on exactly this resemblance as evidence of South American origin. It is not. The construction technique differs fundamentally beneath the surface. The resemblance is superficial, and the dating does not support it. What it actually demonstrates is that Rapa Nui stoneworkers, given basalt and time, were extremely good. The greatest of the platforms is Ahu Tongariki on the southeastern coast, near the quarry. It carried 15 moai in a single line, the largest of them nearly 90 tons, standing along a platform some 200 meters long with the ocean behind them and the volcano rising in front. It is the largest ceremonial structure in Polynesia. Standing in front of it gives a physical sense of the arithmetic that no description manages. 15 figures in a line, the tallest well over 8 meters, on a platform long enough that you cannot photograph the whole thing without backing a long way off. Behind them, the Pacific, with nothing between that shore and Antarctica. In front of them, the ground rising toward Rano Raraku, where they were carved, a couple of kilometers away. Close enough that on a clear day you can stand at Tongariki and see the quarry that produced everything you are looking at, and follow with your eye the route each of those 90-ton figures traveled to get here. In 1960, an earthquake off Chile sent a tsunami across the Pacific, which struck that coast and threw the already fallen statues far inland, scattering them across the site. The restoration, carried out in the 1990s by a Chilean archaeologist working with the Rapa Nui community and with a crane donated by a Japanese company, put all 15 back up. They stand there now, and photographs of them at dawn are the image most people carry of the island. There is also alignment. Many ahu are oriented with evident care. A number face the solstice or equinox sunrise or sunset, and their placement around the coast maps the territorial divisions of the island's lineages. The platforms were boundary markers, temples, tombs, calendars, and statements of a family's standing, all in one structure. When a lineage raised a larger statue than its neighbors, everyone on that shore could see it. That is not a small motive, and it may be much of the answer to why the statues kept getting bigger. A moai standing on its platform in the 15th century did not look like the weathered grey figures in the photographs. It was finished, and the finishing changed everything. Start with the eyes. For centuries it was assumed the deep sockets had always been empty. Then, in 1978, during restoration work at one of the platforms, archaeologists sifting the fill found fragments of white coral, shaped and polished, along with a disc of red scoria. Fitted together they made an eye, a white coral sclera with a red or dark stone pupil, and it fitted the socket of a moai exactly. The statues had eyes. They were inserted, it appears, only when a moai was raised on its ahu and ritually activated, which is why the eyes are found at the platforms and never in the quarry. A statue in the workshop was not yet awake. Putting the eyes in was the moment the ancestor began to see. The effect would have been overwhelming. A 5-meter figure standing above the village on its stone platform, and rather than blank hollows, enormous white eyes with dark pupils, looking down and inland, catching the light. The Rapa Nui word for the sacred power that flowed through such a figure is mana, and the eyes were the channel. The statues were not decorations or memorials. They were understood to be present, watching, active on behalf of the family that raised them. Then there is the pukao, the cylindrical mass of red stone that sits on the heads of many of the larger statues. It is often called a hat or a topknot, and the second is closer. It most likely represents a traditional male hairstyle, hair bound up in a bun on the crown of the head. The red colour was almost certainly the point rather than an accident of what was available. Red is a sacred colour across Polynesia, associated with chiefly rank and with the gods, reserved in many islands for high-status objects and persons. Putting a mass of red stone on the head of an ancestor figure was not decoration. It was an assertion about status, in a colour everyone on the island could read at a glance from a long way off. The pukao were carved from red scoria, a light porous volcanic rock quarried at a completely different site from the statues, at Punapau, and they are not small. The largest weigh more than 10 tons, which means that after moving an 80-ton statue several kilometers and standing it upright, the community then had to lift a 10-ton cylinder of red stone several meters into the air and set it precisely on the statue's head. And it was a different quarry, which means a second complete transport operation for every pukao. Quarrying at Punapau on the other side of the island, shaping the cylinder, moving it. Possibly by rolling, since a cylinder is the one shape that will roll. Across several kilometers of ground to a platform where a statue was already standing, and then getting it up there. How they did that is another argument, with the most persuasive current suggestion being a ramp and lever technique using stone packing. Building the statue up on a stone ramp as it is levered upright, then rolling the pukao up the same ramp. Whatever the method, the point stands. The effort did not end when the statue arrived. It ended when the ancestor had his hair and his eyes and could see. And there is a small piece of evidence that shows how carefully this was thought about. The pukao are not simply set on top. Many have a shallow recess or socket cut into the underside that fits over the crown of the statue's head, locking it in place. Someone had to know the exact dimensions of the head of a statue several kilometers away in order to carve a matching socket in a 10-ton cylinder at a different quarry. That is measurement, communication, and planning across sites. And it had to be right, because a 10-ton cylinder that does not fit is not a thing you adjust once it is up there. We know what the moai were. The harder question is why a small population on a remote island poured so much of its collective labor into making them for so long on an ever-increasing scale. The base answer is ancestor veneration, and that is genuine but incomplete, because every Polynesian society venerated ancestors and none of the others did this. What made Rapa Nui different appears to be a combination of three things. The first is competition. The island was divided among lineages, each with its territory running from the interior down to a stretch of coast, each with its ahu, each with its chief and its ancestors. In a closed system, where everyone can see everyone else's monuments, and where a family's standing is expressed through the manner of its ancestors, statue building becomes a status competition, and status competitions escalate. The archaeological record shows exactly the escalation you would predict. Statues getting larger over time, platforms getting more elaborate, until the last and largest ones strain the limits of what could be moved at all. The pattern is recognizable from cathedral spires in medieval Europe and from the height race between American skyscrapers in the 1920s, prestige measured in something visible with the neighbors watching. It is also a pattern that tends to end abruptly rather than gradually. Escalation continues until it hits a hard physical limit and then stops. Te Takanga, the 200-ton giant still lying unfinished in the quarry, is what hitting that limit looks like. This is not unique to Rapa Nui. It is what monumental traditions do everywhere, from cathedral spires to skyscrapers. The second is the material. As noted, most societies cannot carve 5-meter human figures because they do not have a mountain of workable stone. Rapa Nui did. The presence of Rano Raraku made a certain kind of ambition physically possible, and once the tradition began, the quarry could supply it indefinitely. The third, and most interesting, is that the statues may have been doing practical work as well as spiritual work. This is a more recent line of argument, and it is speculative but grounded. Hunt and Lipo and others have noted that Ahu locations correlate strongly with the island's scarce freshwater sources, the coastal seeps where fresh groundwater emerges at the shoreline. On an island without rivers, those seeps were survival, and the platforms cluster around them. If the Ahu marked and sanctified the water, then the statues were standing over the most critical resource on the island, and the ritual system that maintained them was also a system for regulating access to water between lineages. Monument building of that kind is not a diversion of resources away from survival. It is part of how the society organized survival. And there is a broader point worth making, because the popular story gets it backwards. Building the moai is routinely described as the Rapa Nui's fatal indulgence, the obsession that consumed their forests and doomed them. But an enormous, sustained, multi-generational construction program is not the behavior of a society in crisis. It is the behavior of a society that is well organized, well fed enough to release labor from food production, socially stable enough to plan across generations, and confident about the future. The statues are evidence of success, not of madness. Whatever went wrong on Rapa Nui, it did not go wrong because they were carving. It is worth pausing on the scale, because the numbers say something about the society that no individual statue does. There are roughly 900 moai on the island. About 400 remain in the quarry at Rano Raraku in various states of completion. Something over 300 were successfully transported and raised on Ahu around the coast. Nearly 100 were abandoned in transit, lying along the roads where they fell. The rest are scattered or fragmentary. Take the transported ones alone. Each represents months to a year of carving by a specialist crew, the labor of cutting it free and lowering it down the quarry slope, a transport operation involving perhaps dozens of people and hundreds of meters of rope over a route that might run 12 or more kilometers, the construction or extension of a stone platform, the raising of the statue upright, the quarrying, transport, and lifting of a multi-ton pucao from a different site, and the making and fitting of coral eyes. Then multiply by 300. Then remember that the island's total population, on current estimates, was in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 people, and possibly less. That is a staggering per capita commitment. Compare it to any other monumental society, and Rapa Nui comes out extraordinary. Egypt had the Nile and millions of subjects, Rome had an empire, the Maya had cities and a large agricultural hinterland. Rapa Nui had 160 square kilometers of windy volcanic rock and a few thousand people, and it produced a monumental tradition that any of those civilizations would have recognized as serious. And it did it without the one thing every other monumental society had, a surplus generated by something other than its own soil. Egypt had the Nile's flood and taxed a kingdom. Rome had provinces. The Maya had trade across Mesoamerica. Rapa Nui had a rock in the sea and whatever its own people could grow on it, and out of that margin. The difference between what a few thousand farmers could produce and what they needed to eat came 900 statues. It also tells you something about how the society must have been organized. Sustaining that program for centuries required reliable food surplus, coordinated labor across lineages, specialist craft knowledge transmitted through generations, and a system of authority capable of directing large collective efforts. Whatever else the Rapa Nui were, they were not a scattering of subsistence farmers barely hanging on. There is a further implication that is easy to miss. A multi-generational construction program requires something rarer than food surplus. It requires institutional continuity. The statue a crew began carving might not be finished by the same men who started it. The road a lineage cleared would serve statues raised decades later. The knowledge of how to move an 80-ton figure without killing anyone had to survive intact across generations, transmitted through apprenticeship on an island with no writing. That implies stable social structures, reliable succession, and a shared long-term project that outlived any individual, which is, in the end, what every civilization is. They were an organized, productive, and ambitious society working at the limits of what their island allowed. And, as we shall see, they were rather better at working those limits than they have been given credit for. We have stood in the workshop and seen how the giants were made and moved and raised. Before we turn to the harder part of the story, the night pauses again, here at Rano Raraku, at the end of a working day in the 15th century. The sun is going down behind the island, and the long light is coming across the slope of the quarry at a low angle, the way it does at the end of the day, catching every carved surface and throwing the hollows into shadow. The rock face is warm to the touch. Half-finished ancestors lie in their beds along the slope, faces up, some barely blocked out, some so nearly complete that you could put a hand on the nose and the brow and feel the shape a person intended. The carvers are stopping. There is a rhythm to that. The striking of stone on stone slowing and becoming ragged as people finish what they were on, then the last few blows, then quiet. Basalt picks are gathered and stacked, or dropped where they lie if they have broken. Stone dust is on everything, in the hair, on the hands, drifted in the folds of the carving beds. Someone is coiling rope. Somebody laughs further up the slope, and it carries a long way in the evening stillness. Below the quarry, out on the flat ground, stand the finished statues that have been cut free and set upright to await transport, half buried in the pits that hold them steady, looking out over the plain. They will stand there tonight, as they stood last night, catching the last of the light on their faces after the slope below has gone into shadow. Beyond them, the ground runs down toward the coast, and the sea is turning from blue to steel to dark, and the swell is coming in on the black rocks the way it always does, and the sound of it reaches even up here. There is a great quiet in that hour, and a great rest in it. The day's work is done. Some of these statues will make it to their platforms and stand over their families with coral eyes for generations. Some will fall on the road and stay where they fall. 400 will never leave this slope at all, and will still be lying here in 600 years when people come from the other side of the world to photograph them. But none of that has happened yet. Tonight there is only the warm rock, and the stone dust settling, and the tools stacked at the foot of the face, and the ancestors lying in the grass with the last gold light on them, waiting to be finished. Rest here a while, in the evening at the quarry, before we go on. The wind drops off toward dark, as it usually does here, and the sound of the surf comes up from the coast more clearly once the day noise has gone out of the air. The evening smells of stone dust and dry grass and, faintly, of wood smoke from the village down the slope where the cooking fires have been lit. Someone has left a water gourd in the shade of a half-carved statue and will come back for it in the morning. Down on the flat ground, the standing statues catch the very last of the light on their brows and their noses, while everything below them has already gone blue with dusk, so that for a few minutes there is a line of pale faces glowing above the darkening plain. Then that goes too. Somebody starts down the path toward the village with a coil of rope over one shoulder. Behind him, the slope of the quarry holds the day's warmth in the rock, and 400 unfinished ancestors lie in the grass looking up at the first stars. Now we come to the part of this story that most people think they already know, and it needs to be told properly and fairly before it can be examined, because it is not a stupid story. It was constructed by serious people from real evidence, and parts of it are true. The narrative runs like this. Polynesians arrive on a forested island and find it rich. The population grows. The society organizes itself into competing lineages, and those lineages begin building statues to display their standing. Statue building escalates into an arms race. Moving and raising the moai consumes timber and rope on an enormous scale, and clearing land for gardens consumes more, and the great palms are felled faster than they regenerate. Eventually, the last tree comes down. With the forest goes the topsoil, which erodes. With the forest goes the timber for ocean-going canoes, so deep-sea fishing collapses. With the forest goes much of the island's bird population. Food runs short. The population crashes. The society descends into warfare between starving clans who overthrow each other's ancestors, hence the toppled statues, and, in the darkest version, into cannibalism. When Europeans arrive, they find the wreckage, a diminished people living among the ruins of a civilization that destroyed itself. The lesson drawn from this is explicit and was the whole point of telling it. Easter Island is a scale model of the Earth. A closed system, finite resources, a population that consumed beyond replacement and could not leave, and a self-inflicted collapse. Jared Diamond made it the centerpiece of a best-selling book on societal collapse, and it has appeared in countless documentaries, textbooks, and speeches. It is one of the most successful pieces of environmental storytelling ever produced, and it did not begin with modern environmentalism. The idea that the Rapa Nui had degenerated from some earlier greatness runs right back through the European literature to the 18th century, and it always served the same function. It explained why the people standing in front of the visitors did not match the monuments behind them. In the 19th century, the explanation was racial decline. In the 20th, it became ecological self-destruction. The moral framework changed completely, the underlying shape of the story. These people fell from what they were, through some fault in themselves, did not. And the same shape appears wherever European visitors found monuments they did not expect. Great Zimbabwe was attributed to Phoenicians, Arabs, anyone but the Shona who built it, and the colonial government of Rhodesia actively suppressed the archaeological consensus for decades. The mound-building cultures of North America were credited to a vanished race rather than to the ancestors of Native Americans. In every case, the reasoning was identical. The people here now could not have done this, so somebody else must have, and something must have gone wrong with them. Rapa Nui's version of that story has simply survived longer and in a more respectable form than most, and it is a good story. It has a clear moral, an obvious villain in human short-sightedness, and a satisfying ironic shape. The statues that consumed the island standing over its ruin. That shape is exactly what should make a careful person suspicious, because history rarely arranges itself into parables that neatly. Here is what is definitely true in it. The island was forested when people arrived and was almost entirely deforested by the time Europeans came. This is beyond dispute, and the pollen record proves it. The palm is extinct. The island's land birds are gone, and its seabird colonies were reduced to a fraction of their former extent. Statues were toppled at some point, and by the 19th century none were left standing. Something significant changed on Rapa Nui in the centuries before contact. What is now seriously contested is nearly everything else. Whether deforestation was primarily caused by statue building, whether it caused a demographic collapse at all, whether there was a pre-contact population crash, whether starvation and endemic warfare occurred, and whether the toppling of the statues means what the story says it means. Over the past 25 years, a considerable body of archaeological work has pushed back on each of these, and the resulting argument is one of the sharpest in modern archaeology. Let us take the pieces in turn. Start with the forest. because that is the firmest ground. Pollen cores taken from the sediment of the crater lakes give a continuous record of the island's vegetation going back thousands of years, and they show the same thing everywhere. Before human arrival, Rapa Nui was covered in woodland dominated by a large palm, Pachylococos disperta, related to the Chilean wine palm and now entirely extinct. After human arrival, palm pollen declines and eventually disappears, replaced by grasses. By the time of European contact, the island was essentially treeless. That much is settled science. The question is, what did it? The traditional answer is human cutting. For gardens, for canoes, for firewood, for the ropes and rollers of statue transport. All of that certainly happened, and forest clearance for agriculture in particular must have been substantial. A growing population on a small island needs planting ground, and the way to get planting ground is to clear. But there is another candidate, and the evidence for it is physical and specific. The Polynesian rat arrived with the first canoe. On an island with no native land predators and an unlimited supply of palm nuts, a rat population can grow at a rate that is difficult to overstate. Modeling from other Pacific islands suggests populations reaching millions within a few years, and rats eat palm seeds. We know they ate these particular palm seeds because thousands of preserved palm nuts have been recovered from Rapa Nui, and a very large proportion of them show the characteristic gnaw marks of rats, with the endosperm eaten out. A palm nut that has been hollowed by a rat does not germinate. And the arithmetic of rat population growth on an island with no predators is worth stating, because it is the part people find hardest to believe. A pair of Polynesian rats, with unlimited food and nothing hunting them, can produce a population in the millions within a very few years. The doubling time is measured in weeks, not seasons. Estimates for Rapa Nui have put the peak rat population somewhere in the millions on an island of 160 square kilometers. Every one of those animals needed to eat, and the most abundant, most nutritious, most easily obtained food on the island was palm nuts lying on the forest floor. The gnawed nuts recovered from Rapa Nui sites are not an occasional find. They are the normal condition of preserved palm nuts on that island, which means that even if the Rapa Nui had cut nothing at all, the forest was under a sentence. Mature trees would live out their long lives and die, and nothing would replace them because every seed that hit the ground was being eaten. Deforestation on Rapa Nui was almost certainly a two-agent process: human clearance removing standing trees and rats preventing regeneration. And there is a serious argument that the rats were the more decisive of the two. This matters for how the story is told. In the parable version, the Rapa Nui knowingly destroyed their own forest through greed and ritual excess, and the moral is human folly. In the version the evidence better supports, the forest was doomed largely by an invasive species that arrived on the founding canoe, whose effects were invisible for decades. Because a forest with no seedlings looks perfectly healthy until the mature trees start dying, and whose consequences no one on the island could have understood or prevented with the knowledge available. That is not a story about a society's moral failure. It is a story about an ecological trap that closed slowly and silently, and it is a far more common shape of environmental disaster than the parable admits. It is also worth noting what the Rapa Nui evidently did once the situation became clear. Analysis of charcoal and wood use over time shows the islanders switching to smaller species and to shrubs as the large timber declined, and there is evidence of managed regrowth in some areas. Attempts, in other words, to work with what remained rather than simply consuming to the end. Whether these amounted to deliberate conservation or merely to adaptation is difficult to establish at this distance. But the picture of a people cutting obliviously until the last tree fell does not match a record that shows them progressively adjusting to a shrinking resource across generations. There is also a climatic factor that is sometimes forgotten. Rapa Nui sits at the cool southern edge of the range in which that palm could live, and the centuries in question included regional climatic shifts that would have put additional stress on a forest already failing to regenerate. Multiple causes, compounding over generations. Here is where the revision becomes most direct and most contested. The collapse narrative requires a large pre-contact population that crashed. The classic figures put the peak at 15,000, sometimes 20,000 or even more, falling to 2,000 or 3,000 by the time Europeans arrived. Those numbers are the engine of the whole story. A fall of that magnitude implies mass mortality, which implies famine and violence. Where did they come from? Largely from estimates of carrying capacity and the labor required for the statues, rather than from direct archaeological evidence of that many people. Population estimates for pre-modern societies are notoriously elastic in any case. The same site can yield figures differing by a factor of 5 depending on assumptions about household size, occupation length, and how much of the settlement has been found. On Rapa Nui, the elasticity was compounded by the fact that the number wanted was one that would explain a crash. And when researchers went looking for direct evidence, settlement remains, house foundations, garden features, the material footprint of 15,000 people, they have consistently found less than the high estimates predict. Recent work using systematic survey of the island's cultivated areas, including detailed analysis of where crops could actually have been grown, has produced estimates in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 for the sustainable population, which is roughly what Europeans actually found in the 18th century. Not a remnant of a crashed civilization, a stable population living within the island's means. And there is a further point about those older high estimates that is rarely made. They were generated in part by asking how many people it would take to build the statues. And then the resulting number was used as evidence that the population had crashed, since only a few thousand were found later. That is circular. If the walking method is correct, the labor requirement for statue transport drops by an order of magnitude. 18 people moved a 5-ton replica, and even scaling generously, moving a large moai becomes a job for a village rather than an army. Take away the inflated labor estimate, and the inflated population estimate goes with it, and with them goes the crash they were invoked to prove. The evidence for famine and endemic warfare is also weaker than the story requires. Skeletal remains from the island have been examined for the markers you would expect from chronic malnutrition and from violent death, and the results do not show a population in crisis. Rates of traumatic injury consistent with violent conflict are low, and there is no clear signal of widespread starvation. The obsidian objects, long described as spearheads, mata, found in large numbers and used to argue for endemic warfare, have been re-examined, and their shapes are highly variable and generally poorly suited to piercing. The current view among a number of researchers is that most were general-purpose cutting and scraping tools for agricultural and craft work, not weapons of war. The analysis behind that conclusion is straightforward and rather elegant. If a class of objects is a weapon type, its shapes should cluster. Weapons designed to do a specific lethal job converge on a narrow range of forms, because the physics of piercing is unforgiving. When researchers measured a large sample of matter and analyzed the variation in their outlines, they found the opposite. Enormous variability, with most examples broad, blunt-tipped, and shaped in ways that would be poor for penetration and good for scraping, cutting, and working plant material. Compare them with the obsidian weapons of societies that genuinely fought with obsidian, and they do not look like the same category of object at all. Combined with the low rate of traumatic injury in the skeletal record, the case for endemic lethal warfare on Rapa Nui becomes much weaker than the popular account requires. And the cannibalism claim, which recurs in popular accounts, rests on very thin evidence and on 19th century missionary reports of a kind that were made about a great many indigenous peoples, and that historians now treat with heavy caution. None of this means nothing happened. Deforestation was real and must have had consequences. Losing ocean-going canoes meant losing deep-sea fishing and, more profoundly, meant the island was now genuinely a prison. No one could leave, and no one could arrive. The fishbone record from island middens shows exactly this shift. The proportion of deep-water species such as tuna and porpoise declines over time, and inshore fish and shellfish rise, along with chicken. That is a real change in diet and a real loss of a food source, and it must have mattered. But it is a shift, not a famine. The islanders replaced one protein source with others, intensified their chicken production, and built the stone chicken houses called hare moa that are scattered across the island in the hundreds, long, low structures of piled stone with small entrances designed to keep birds secure at night. Once again, the response to a lost resource was engineering, not starvation. Society changed. Statue carving stopped. A new religious cult emerged. Statues came down. Something significant occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries. But something significant occurred is a long way from a civilization destroyed itself. The strongest version of the revisionist case, made by Hunt and Lipo and supported to varying degrees by a growing body of work, is that the Rapa Nui did not collapse before European contact at all. They adapted, and the evidence for how they adapted is lying all over the island and was for a long time overlooked because it is not glamorous. If you fly over Rapa Nui or walk across its interior with someone who knows what to look for, you will see that enormous areas of the island are covered in rocks. Not naturally, arranged. Broken volcanic stone, scattered and heaped and set in patterns across the ground over something like 10% of the island's surface, and possibly more. For a long time, visitors saw this as evidence of a ruined landscape, a stony waste, the eroded remains of soil that had blown away after the trees came down. It is the opposite. It is agriculture, and it is sophisticated. The technique is called lithic mulching, and it is practiced in a number of dry and windy environments around the world, though rarely on this scale. You break up volcanic rock and spread it over your planting ground, or build low walls and enclosures of it. The rocks do several things at once. They shelter young plants from the wind, which on Rapa Nui is relentless and desiccating. They shade the soil surface and reduce evaporation, conserving scarce moisture. They absorb heat during the day and release it at night, moderating temperature swings in a cool climate at the edge of what tropical crops can tolerate. And, over time, they weather and release mineral nutrients, potassium, phosphorus, back into soil that is losing fertility. In some areas, the Rapa Nui built walled garden enclosures, manavai, circular stone-walled pits within which plants grow in a protected microclimate. You can still see them, and they still work. This is not the practice of a society falling apart. It is intensive, knowledge-heavy, labor-expensive agricultural engineering developed and deployed across a substantial fraction of an island by people responding intelligently to exactly the problems they faced: wind, drought, cooling, and declining soil. It requires understanding the mechanism, organizing the labor to move an enormous quantity of stone by hand, and maintaining the system across generations. And the scale of stone moving involved deserves stating, because it dwarfs the statues. Estimates of the rock deployed across Rapa Nui's mulched gardens run into the millions of tons. Every piece of it broken out, carried, and placed by hand over many generations across something like 10 to 20% of the island's surface. All 900 moai together weigh a small fraction of that. If the Rapa Nui had built no statues at all, the rock gardens alone would still constitute one of the largest hand-built agricultural works anywhere in Oceania. It is simply that gardens do not photograph well and giants do. And the timing matters. This intensification appears to have developed in the very period the collapse narrative describes as the descent into chaos. As the forest went and conditions became harder, the Rapa Nui did what capable societies do. They innovated. They found a way to keep producing food from a landscape that had changed under them, and by the estimates of the researchers who have surveyed those garden systems, they were succeeding, feeding a stable population of a few thousand indefinitely. Set the two pictures side by side and choose which the evidence better supports. Picture 1. A doomed people, having wrecked their island, starving and fighting among the ruins until Europeans stumbled on the wreckage. Picture 2. A people whose forest failed for reasons largely beyond their control and understanding, who responded by re-engineering the entire agricultural basis of their society across 10% of the island's surface, and who were living stably within their means when the first ship arrived. Neither picture is a fairy tale, and the second is not a claim that nothing went wrong. Losing a forest is a serious loss, and it changed the island permanently. The point is about what the loss did to the people, whether it broke them, or whether they absorbed it and kept going. The rocks say they kept going. The rocks are still lying there. They are the single most extensive human modification of the island's landscape, larger by far than all the statues put together, and almost nobody has heard of them. There is a further refinement that shows how well the system was understood. Analysis of the garden areas indicates that the Rapa Nui were not simply spreading rock at random, but selecting where to do it, concentrating the most intensive mulching in places where the combination of soil, drainage, and shelter would repay the effort, and using different densities of stone in different conditions. Some areas show evidence of deliberately quarrying fresh rock and breaking it to expose unweathered surfaces, which release nutrients faster. That is not a folk habit. That is a technology, refined by observation across generations, deployed with judgment. And it worked well enough that when researchers modeled the productive capacity of the island's cultivated area, the answer came out at a stable few thousand people. The same number that was actually there when the ships arrived. Before we follow the story into the 19th century, it is worth spending a moment on the European encounters themselves, because the record they left is the only outside description of Rapa Nui before everything changed, and because what those visitors saw is often quoted and rarely examined. The Dutch came first, on Easter Sunday 1722, under Jacob Roggeveen, which is where the European name comes from, and it has stuck for 300 years despite having nothing to do with the island. They stayed a matter of days. They recorded statues standing, a population they estimated in the low thousands, gardens under cultivation, and people who came out to the ships in small, leaky canoes patched together from many small pieces of wood, which the Dutch noted with some surprise. That detail is significant. By 1722, the island could no longer build a proper canoe. The visit ended badly, with a confused incident on shore in which the Dutch opened fire and killed a number of islanders. Then they sailed away, and no one came for 48 years. The Dutch account is worth reading closely for one detail that later became contentious. Roggeveen's men described statues that appeared to be made of clay packed with pebbles rather than solid stone, because they could not believe such objects had been carved and moved by the people in front of them. That reflex, the assumption that the islanders were incapable, appears in the very first European document about Rapa Nui and never entirely went away. The Spanish arrived in 1770 from Peru and formally annexed the island for the Spanish crown in a ceremony in which island leaders were invited to make marks on a document. An episode that some scholars think may have influenced the development or the use of rongorongo, since it demonstrated to the Rapa Nui that marks on a surface could carry authority. The Spanish also recorded statues standing. Cook came in 1774, and his account is the one most often cited, because it is the most detailed and because it is bleak. He found an island that seemed to him poor, sparse, and short of everything. Few people, little food to trade, a landscape without timber. His crew noted statues, some fallen. Cook's expedition included a Tahitian, Maheen, who could speak with the islanders directly, which makes the record unusually valuable. What Cook described is generally read as evidence of a society in decline. It should also be read in context. He arrived after a probable period of drought, stayed briefly, saw the western coast, and was comparing everything he saw with the abundance of Tahiti, which is one of the most fertile places on Earth. A small windy island at the cool edge of Polynesia was always going to look poor next to that. The French came in 1786, under Le Pérouse, and left a notably different impression. He described extensive and well-tended plantations, a healthy population, and people who seemed to him to be managing their island competently. And he explicitly disagreed with the idea that they were in distress, observing that they simply lived on a dry island and had arranged their agriculture accordingly. Le Pérouse's account, being cheerful, is quoted far less often than Cook's. Set the visits together, and a pattern appears that is worth carrying into the next part of the story. Every European visitor before the 19th century described a functioning society, cultivated, organized, populated in the low thousands, poor in timber and short on fresh water but going concerns. Statues were standing in 1722, standing in 1770, and increasingly falling thereafter. Whatever happened to the Rapa Nui, it had not happened yet when the first outsiders wrote them down. Every moai that stood on an ahu was, at some point, pulled down. When the Dutch arrived in 1722, they described statues standing. By the time of later visits through the 18th century, observers recorded more and more of them fallen, and by the middle of the 19th century, not a single moai remained upright on its platform anywhere on the island. Every statue you see standing today has been re-erected in modern times. That is a fact worth holding on to when looking at any photograph of Easter Island. The famous images, the line at Tongariki, the 7 at Akivi, the ones with topknots at Anakina, are all modern restorations, carried out between the 1950s and the 1990s by archaeologists working with the Rapa Nui community. What a visitor in 1900 would have seen was an island of fallen giants lying face down in the grass, exactly as they had been left. The upright Easter Island in everyone's mind is, in a literal sense, a 20th century reconstruction of a 15th century one. The Rapa Nui call this period huri moai, the toppling of the statues. And in the collapse narrative, it is the climax. Starving clans in a war of all against all, destroying each other's ancestors, the ultimate act of a society consuming itself. There are reasons to be careful with that reading. The first is timing. The toppling was not a single event. It took place over a long period, and much of it happened after European contact, which is to say, during precisely the decades when the island was being subjected to introduced disease, slave raiding, missionary conversion, and social upheaval from outside. Attributing the whole process to pre-contact civil war requires ignoring what was actually happening to the island in the 18th and 19th centuries. The second is the manner. Statues were not simply knocked over at random. Many were toppled face down. In a number of cases, stones appear to have been placed where the statue's neck would land, which breaks it. That is not the mindless destruction of a mob. It is deliberate, and it looks ritual. Pulling down a statue face down and breaking its neck is a considered act with a meaning, in a culture where the statue's power resided in its face and its eyes. The third is what deactivation means in this context. Toppling an ancestor figure is a religious act, the ritual negation of a monument's power. It may be an act of aggression by a rival lineage. It may equally be a lineage's own decommissioning of statues whose efficacy had failed, or whose meaning had been superseded by a new religious order, or which belonged to a system that no longer commanded belief. Religions change. Old gods get retired, and the retiring is often violent in form and internal in origin, and it does not require a famine to explain it, because something new had arrived on Rapa Nui. And there is a further consideration about the toppling that the collapse narrative rarely mentions: earthquakes and tsunamis. The island sits in a seismically active part of the Pacific, and a moai standing several meters tall on a stone platform with a 10-ton cylinder balanced on its head is not a structure that shrugs off ground movement. The 1960 Chilean earthquake demonstrated exactly what the ocean can do to that coast when it decides to, throwing multi-ton statues well inland at Tongariki. Over 5 centuries there will have been others. Some proportion of the fallen moai almost certainly came down without any human help at all, and separating those from deliberate topplings is not always possible after the fact. Statue carving had stopped. The quarry lies frozen mid-work, and a different religious practice had taken hold, centered on a different site, a different power, and a completely different way of choosing who ruled. The transition was probably not abrupt. Ho Hakananaya, the statue now in London, has birdman motifs carved onto the back of what is otherwise a traditional ancestor figure, which suggests a period in which the two systems overlapped and the old images were being adapted to the new order rather than simply discarded. Religions rarely replace one another cleanly. They layer, and the layering is usually visible in the objects, centered on a different site, a different power, and a completely different way of choosing who ruled. The ancestors came down, and the birdman went up. On the southwestern corner of the island, on the narrow rim of the great crater of Rano Raraku, there is a village of low stone houses built into the slope with corbelled roofs and turf over them, looking out over a 1,000-foot drop to the ocean and, a little way offshore, 3 rocky islets. The village is called Orongo, and it was not a place where anyone lived year-round. It was a ceremonial site, occupied for 1 season each year, for one purpose. The cult was called Tangata Manu, the birdman, and it centered on the arrival, each spring, of the sooty terns that came to nest on the largest of the offshore islets, Motu Nui. Each competing lineage put forward a champion, a young man called a hopo. At the appointed time, these men climbed down the cliff from Orongo, swam through open ocean water across a channel to the islet. A serious swim in cold water with sharks in it, usually on a bundle of reeds, and waited on Motu Nui, sometimes for days or weeks, for the first egg of the season to be laid. The man who found the first egg shouted the news across the water to his sponsor, waiting on the cliff. He then had to swim back with the egg intact, traditionally bound to his forehead, and climb the cliff again. And his sponsor, not the swimmer, became the Tangata Manu, the birdman, for the year, a sacred figure invested with enormous prestige and ritual authority, secluded and tapu, his lineage holding privileges over the island until the next egg the following spring. Look at what this system does. It is an annual, ritualized, competitive contest that redistributes authority between lineages every year by a rule everyone accepts, with the outcome decided by something no faction can control: the arrival of a bird. It replaces a system in which power was inherited and expressed through permanent monuments with one in which power rotates and is expressed through an event. Consider what problem that solves. On an island nobody can leave, a permanent hierarchy has a structural danger. If one lineage accumulates dominance and the others have no route to power and nowhere to go, the pressure has only one outlet. An annual contest, decided by an external and unriggable event, converts that pressure into a ritual with a scheduled resolution and a fresh chance every spring. Anthropologists have described similar mechanisms in other closed or resource-constrained societies, and they tend to appear precisely where the alternative is chronic conflict. Whether the Rapa Nui designed it consciously is unknowable. That it functioned that way is hard to miss. Whatever else it is a mechanism for managing competition between groups on an island where competition could not be resolved by anyone leaving. That is a strikingly sophisticated piece of social technology, and it is the opposite of what a society in terminal collapse produces. There is also a suggestion, argued by some researchers, that the birdman contest served a practical purpose beyond politics. It regulated harvesting. The seabird colonies on the offshore islets were a food resource, and an unregulated free-for-all each spring would have destroyed them. A system in which access is ritualized, the season is fixed, the first egg is sacred, and the whole thing is supervised by an authority that changes hands annually is, whatever else it is, a functioning management regime for a fragile resource. Whether that was the intention or a consequence is beyond recovering. That it was the effect is difficult to argue with. The carvings at Orongo are dense with birdman figures cut into the rock, hundreds of them, and the ceremonies continued into the 19th century until missionaries suppressed them. The last birdman competitions were held in the 1860s, ending not because the society failed, but because outsiders stopped it. And the setting deserves a moment of its own, because it is one of the most dramatic ceremonial sites anywhere. Orongo sits on a knife edge of land, perhaps a few dozen meters wide, with the enormous crater of Rano Raraku dropping away on one side to the reed-covered lake far below, and on the other a sheer cliff falling straight to the ocean. The stone houses are built low into the slope, roofed with corbelled slabs and turfed over, so that from a distance the village is barely visible against the ridge. You have to be almost on top of it before it resolves into architecture. Inside, the rooms are dark and narrow, and you enter on hands and knees. Outside, the rocks are covered with carvings, birdman figures in relief, hundreds of them, crouching human bodies with the heads of frigate birds, cut into the basalt over generations by people recording each year's victory. And beyond the cliff edge, out in the water, the three islets, with the largest a bare 1.5 kilometers away across a channel that looks, from up there, considerably wider than any sane person would want to swim. So the picture of the 17th and 18th centuries changes shape. It is not the story of a civilization dying. It is the story of a society under real environmental pressure, transforming itself, changing how it farmed, changing how it worshipped, changing how it allocated power, retiring the old ancestors and adopting a new order. Societies that can do that are not collapsing. They are surviving. We come now to the part of the story that the parable version leaves in the footnotes, and it is the part where the population of Rapa Nui actually did collapse. It happened, it is thoroughly documented, and it had nothing to do with statues or palm trees. The 18th century brought European ships at intervals. The Dutch in 1722, a Spanish expedition in 1770, Captain Cook in 1774, a French expedition in 1786. And with them the standard consequences of first contact, introduced diseases against which an isolated population had no immunity, and the beginnings of exploitation. Cook, who arrived when the island was clearly under strain, described a poor and sparse population and did not stay long. Through the first half of the 19th century, whaling and sealing vessels called with increasing frequency, and relations were often violent. Then came 1862. In December of that year, a fleet of Peruvian ships arrived off the coast, engaged in the slave trade that was then supplying labor to guano mines and plantations on the South American mainland. Over the following months, raiders took somewhere in the region of 1,500 Rapa Nui, roughly a third to a half of the entire population, including, deliberately, the king, his heir, and a large proportion of the priestly and learned class, the men who held the island's oral traditions, genealogies, and, as we shall see, its writing. International protest eventually forced Peru to repatriate the survivors. By then, most had died of disease and overwork in the mines. Of the 1,500 taken, about 100 were put on a ship home. Most of those died on the voyage. About 15 reached Rapa Nui alive, and they carried smallpox with them. The epidemic that followed swept an island whose population had already been gutted and whose social and religious leadership had been carried away. Missionaries arrived in the following years into a devastated society and set about conversion, and the old practices ended. Then came the land. An enterprising Frenchman acquired much of the island for sheep ranching, further dispossessing the survivors, and by the 1870s a large proportion of the remaining Rapa Nui had left or been removed to Tahiti to work on plantations. By 1877, the population of Rapa Nui was 111 people. It is worth pausing on what a number like that means beyond the arithmetic of death. 111 people is below the threshold at which a society can maintain its full body of specialist knowledge. The carvers were gone, and with them the accumulated technique of a 500-year tradition. The navigators were long gone. The people who knew the genealogies, which on a Polynesian island is the framework that organizes land, rank, obligation, and identity, were among the first taken in 1862, because the raiders took the elite deliberately. That is worth stating without euphemism. The ships did not take a random sample. They took the people who were easiest to identify as leaders and the people who came out to negotiate, which meant the king, the heir, and the men whose function was to hold and recite what the island knew. The tablet readers were gone. What survived was survival itself, a language, a set of families, an attachment to a place, and the memory that the statues had walked. It turned out to be enough. From those 111 people, and the handful who came back later from Tahiti, the community rebuilt itself across 150 years to the several thousand who are there today, which is its own quiet achievement, and one that nobody makes documentaries about either. Everything that required a class of specialists to hold it went into the ground in the guano mines of Peru within about 3 years. That is the collapse. Not a self-inflicted ecological catastrophe in the 15th century, but a demographic annihilation in the space of 15 years in the 19th, caused by slave raiding, imported disease, and land seizure. And the timing of it makes a further point that is easy to miss. The statues were still being pulled down through this period. The birdman ceremonies were still being held until missionaries stopped them in the 1860s. Rongorongo was still in existence and, quite possibly, still readable by someone until the raids. In other words, much of what the collapse narrative treats as evidence of an ancient self-destruction was actually still going on, or ending, during the decades when outsiders were dismantling the society. Which means those events belong at least as much to the story of contact as to the story of anything the Rapa Nui did to themselves. From an island society of a few thousand to 111 survivors, and from those 111, and a handful who returned later, every Rapa Nui alive today is descended. It is worth sitting with the shape of that for a moment. The story the world tells about Easter Island is that its people destroyed themselves through their own excess, and the moral is a warning to humanity about environmental limits. The documented history is that its people survived deforestation by re-engineering their agriculture, reorganized their religion and politics under pressure, and were living stably on their island when outsiders arrived and reduced them to 111 people in a decade and a half. The parable is not merely inaccurate. It transfers responsibility from the people who caused the catastrophe to the people who suffered it, and it has been taught in schools around the world for 50 years. And it did so, it should be said, without malice. The scholars who built the narrative were not attempting to defame anyone. They were working with the evidence available in the 1970s and 80s. They were genuinely alarmed about global environmental limits, and they found in Rapa Nui a case that seemed to illustrate the danger with unusual clarity. The problem was not motive. The problem was that a compelling story got ahead of the data, hardened into common knowledge before it could be tested, and then proved very difficult to dislodge, because by the time the contrary evidence arrived, the parable had been repeated so often in so many books and classrooms and documentaries that correcting it meant correcting nearly everyone. That is a general hazard worth naming, because it is not confined to this island. A vivid story with a clear moral, once established, becomes extremely difficult to revise. Not because anyone is dishonest, but because the story is now doing work that people value, and the correction is complicated and undramatic and asks them to give up something useful. The parable had a job. The truth does not have one, which is precisely why it travels more slowly. Rapa Nui scholars and community leaders have been saying this for a long time, with a patience that is remarkable under the circumstances. The weighing is done. Before we turn to what the island means and what became of its people, the story pauses one last time, out on the eastern edge of the world, in the middle of the night. It is late over Rapa Nui, and there is no moon. The island is a low, dark shape in an enormous darkness, the highest point rising a little over 500 meters, and the whole triangle no more than 24 kilometers on its longest side. And around it in every direction the ocean goes on for thousands of kilometers without interruption. It is worth pausing on how few places left on Earth are like this. Satellite images of the planet at night show the continents webbed with light and the coastlines blazing. There are very few points on the globe from which a person can look up and see a sky genuinely untouched by human illumination. The middle of the Pacific is one of them, and this island sits at the center of it. The darkness overhead here is the same darkness every human being on Earth looked up into for 200,000 years, and almost nobody alive has seen it. There is no other light anywhere, no distant coast, no glow on any horizon, no ship. There is nothing out there at all, and there was nothing out there for the whole of the island's history, which means the sky is extraordinary. With no moon, no cloud, and no light from any human source within 2,000 kilometers, the stars come down to the horizon on all sides. Not the thinned-out scatter that most people alive today have ever seen, but the full field, layered and dense, with the Milky Way standing up across it like a bar of smoke. The southern constellations wheel slowly over. The Southern Cross low in the sky, the two Magellanic clouds hanging like torn pieces of the galaxy, Scorpius arching over toward the sea. Those are the stars that brought people here. Somewhere in that sky are the rising and setting points that a navigator held in memory, in a sequence learned as a child and practiced across a lifetime. The same stars, in almost the same places, turning over the island tonight as they turned over the canoe that found it. The sky is the one thing on Rapa Nui that has not changed at all. The palms are gone. The birds are mostly gone. The statues came down and some went up again. The people were taken away and came back reduced and endured and are still there. And overhead, unchanged and indifferent, the same stars that were used as a road. The navigators had names for them and knew where each would rise, and the sequence of those risings was a set of directions that could be recited like a poem. Somewhere in that sky tonight is the star that stood over the bow of the canoe that found this island, at the hour it was found, holding the same bearing it held then. The moai stand along the coast in the dark, facing inland, invisible. The surf works at the black rock the way it has for 1,000,000 years. The wind comes off the water and moves over the grass and the scattered stones of the gardens. And above it all, the great southern sky turns slowly, the way it turned for the carvers and the navigators and the birdmen, and the way it is turning tonight over you. Rest here a while, under those stars, on the loneliest island in the world, before the last part of the story. Down at the shore, the swell comes in out of the dark and breaks white and drags back over the stones, and between one wave and the next there is a silence so complete that it has weight to it. There is no engine anywhere on the island tonight, no light in any window, nothing on the water. A shearwater calls somewhere out over the sea, and another answers, and then nothing. The grass on the slope moves in the dark with a dry sound, all together when the air shifts. Far up at Rano Raraku, the crater holds its lake in complete blackness, the reeds standing still on the water. Nothing is awake anywhere on the island except the sea. The grass moves. The statues stand along the coast with their backs to all that ocean, facing the sleeping villages, keeping watch as they were made to do. There is one more mystery on Rapa Nui, and it is the most complete silence of all. In the 1860s, the first missionaries on the island noticed wooden tablets and staffs in the houses, incised with rows of tiny, intricate glyphs, figures of birds and fish and human forms and geometric shapes cut into the wood in dense parallel lines. The islanders called them rongorongo, and they were written in a system that is, to this day, undeciphered. The way they are meant to be read is itself remarkable. The lines run in what is called reverse boustrophadon. You read the bottom line from left to right, then rotate the tablet 180 degrees and read the next line, and so on, turning the object over and over as you go. Every second line is upside down relative to its neighbours. That is not a system anyone invents casually. The glyphs themselves are dense and small, cut with obsidian flakes or shark teeth into wood that has been shaped and often polished, with the lines running in shallow channels. The signs number in the hundreds, figures with heads and limbs, birds, fish, plants, geometric forms, and many combinations in which one sign appears to be built out of others. That combinatorial quality is one of the reasons researchers suspect a genuine writing system rather than a purely mnemonic device. Real scripts build complex signs from simpler components, and rongorongo appears to do exactly that. Roughly 24 genuine rongorongo objects survive in museums around the world, and they represent the total corpus. A few thousand glyphs altogether, which is a desperately small sample for decipherment. And the reason there are so few is the 1862 raids. The people who could read the tablets, if anyone still could by that date, were among those taken: the priests, the learned class, the king. Within a few years of the raids, missionaries reported that no one on the island could read the boards. Many were burned or lost during the upheaval and the conversion. What survives is fragments of a system whose readers were carried off to die in guano mines. Scholars have made real progress on some fronts. One tablet has been shown to contain a lunar calendar. The structure of the glyph sequences has been analysed statistically. A small number of signs have plausible readings. But there is no decipherment, no bilingual key, and no certainty about what kind of writing it even is. And the practical consequence is worth stating plainly. If rongorongo is a true script recording the Rapa Nui language, then somewhere in those 24 surviving objects are genealogies, chants, histories, perhaps an account of the island's own past set down by its own people. That would be the only indigenous documentary record of anything that happened on Rapa Nui before outsiders arrived. It sits in museum cases in Rome and Santiago and St. Petersburg and elsewhere, fully visible as marks on wood, and nobody on earth can read a line of it. Whether a full script recording the Rapa Nui language, a mnemonic system for chants and genealogies, or something between. There is also a genuine debate about when it was invented, with some arguing it developed only after contact with Europeans in 1770, when islanders witnessed Spanish officials signing a document, and others arguing for an independent pre-contact origin, which would make it one of the very few writing systems ever invented from scratch anywhere in human history. We may never know. And that is the sharpest illustration of what was actually lost on Rapa Nui. The trees came down over centuries, and the society adapted. The statues were toppled and are being raised again. But when the ships took the priests in 1862, they took the island's library. Not the objects, which survive, but the only minds in the world that could open them. Whatever those tablets say, they were saying it to people who are gone. There is one further complication that makes decipherment even harder, and it is a poignant one. Some of the surviving tablets were carved on driftwood, and at least one was made from a European ore, meaning that by the time these particular objects were made, suitable wood was so scarce on the island that a sacred text was inscribed on whatever timber the ocean happened to deliver. The most famous piece, a long inscribed staff known as the Santiago staff, carries the largest single body of glyphs in existence. Attempts on it have produced structural observations rather than readings, and the sample problem is brutal. The entire corpus of rongorongo amounts to a few thousand signs. Egyptian hieroglyphs were cracked with the help of a bilingual inscription and millions of surviving characters. Here, there is no bilingual, no certainty about the underlying language's relationship to the signs, and a corpus that would fit in a short pamphlet. Before we go to the island as it is now, it is worth thinking about what the collapse story has cost, because a story told about living people has consequences for those people. Consider what the parable does. It takes an indigenous society and makes it a cautionary tale about human stupidity. It says, these people were so short-sighted, so obsessed with their idols and their status competitions, that they cut down every tree on their own island and starved. The moral is aimed at the modern reader. We are Easter Island, the earth is the island, do not be like them. And the metaphor has real rhetorical power, which is exactly why it spread. A closed system with finite resources and no exit is a genuinely good model of a planet, and the image of a people surrounded by their own monuments while the last tree falls is unforgettable. If the history had actually gone that way, it would be one of the most instructive stories humanity possesses. That is precisely why it needed to be checked carefully. And why, when the checking produced a different answer, the answer took so long to be heard. And the rhetorical force of the lesson depends entirely on the Rapa Nui being the authors of their own destruction. Now consider the position that puts the Rapa Nui in. Their ancestors' greatest achievement, the statues, is recast as the fatal indulgence that doomed them. Their history is used as a global negative example taught to schoolchildren on every continent. And the actual catastrophe that befell them, the raids, the epidemics, the loss of their land, becomes a footnote or disappears entirely because it does not serve the moral. This is not a hypothetical complaint. Rapa Nui people have objected to it consistently and publicly for decades. Their objection has generally not been that environmental limits do not exist, or that the deforestation is fiction. It has been narrower and harder to answer. That a story about their ancestors was constructed by outsiders, on incomplete evidence, for a purpose that had nothing to do with them, and then broadcast globally without their participation. And that when the evidence changed, the correction travelled far more slowly than the original ever did. The islanders live with tourists arriving, having read the story, sometimes asking versions of the question, "How could your ancestors have been so foolish?" It is difficult to imagine a comparable narrative being maintained about a European population without significant pushback. And it is worth noticing how the parable's internal logic depends on a particular assumption about the islanders' intelligence. The story requires that they kept cutting trees while watching the forest disappear, unable to connect cause and effect, driven by ritual compulsion. Which is to say, it requires a people less observant about their own environment than any subsistence society has ever actually been. These were the descendants of navigators who could hold a 32-point star compass in memory and read 4 swell systems through the hull of a canoe. The idea that they failed to notice a forest vanishing around them is not merely unsupported by the evidence, it is implausible on its face. The rat explanation, by contrast, requires no stupidity from anyone. It describes a process that was genuinely invisible until it was irreversible, which is why it took modern archaeologists with sediment cores and preserved seed assemblages to detect it at all. And there is an irony worth naming, given that the story is told in the service of environmentalism. The lesson people take from the parable is that societies destroy themselves through internal greed. The lesson the actual history teaches is at least as urgent and considerably less comfortable, that an invasive species introduced accidentally can quietly dismantle an ecosystem over generations before anyone notices, that societies can respond to environmental degradation with genuine ingenuity and still be vulnerable, and that the most catastrophic thing that happened to this island came from outside, arriving on ships, taking what it wanted. If you are looking for a model of how the modern world damages the places it reaches, Rapa Nui is a far better one than the parable ever was. Only in that version, the reader is not the islander, the reader is on the ship. None of this means environmental limits are not real, or that the deforestation did not matter. It did. The island's forest is genuinely gone, and the palm is genuinely extinct, and human arrival caused it. The honest version keeps that. It is also worth being clear that the revisionist case is a case, not a consensus. Serious archaeologists continue to defend elements of the older account. Some maintain that the pre-contact population was larger than the low estimates allow, that deforestation had more severe consequences than the revisionists concede, and that the evidence for conflict has been too quickly dismissed. Recent work using different methods has produced population estimates across a wide range, and the argument over the matter and over the skeletal trauma data continues in the journals. It is genuinely healthy that it does. An account that could not be challenged would not be science, and the revisionists have their own incentives and blind spots like everybody else. What a listener is entitled to expect is that the state of the argument be described honestly rather than one side of it being presented as settled, which, for 50 years, is exactly what happened with the other side. What has changed decisively is the confidence of the old story. It is no longer possible to present the ecocide narrative as settled fact, because a substantial and growing body of evidence contradicts its central claims. Where the truth sits within the remaining range is a live scientific question, and anyone who tells you otherwise, in either direction, is ahead of the evidence. It simply declines to convert it into a morality play at the expense of a living people, and insists on including the part where the ships came. So what is Rapa Nui now? It is a territory of Chile, annexed in 1888, with a population of somewhere around 8,000. The annexation itself being a document whose two versions, in Spanish and in Rapa Nui, do not say the same thing. The Spanish text speaks of cession of sovereignty. The Rapa Nui text uses language closer to a grant of friendship and protection while reserving the chief's authority over the land. Which version represents what the signatories understood themselves to be doing has been argued about ever since, and it sits underneath every subsequent dispute over land and autonomy on the island, roughly half of them Rapa Nui by descent, the rest largely mainland Chileans. Its economy runs mainly on tourism, something over 100,000 visitors a year in normal times, arriving on flights from Santiago, 5.5 hours over open ocean to see the statues. There is one town, Hangaroa, on the western coast. Nearly everyone lives there. It has a harbour too small for large vessels, a main street, a school, a hospital, a football pitch, a church where the Sunday Mass is sung partly in Rapa Nui, and a cemetery on the shore where the graves look out at the ocean. The church is worth a moment on its own. The carvings inside it fuse Christian imagery with Rapa Nui forms, so that the saints have something of the moai in their faces and traditional motifs run through the decoration. The crucifix carries a bird's head. A Madonna has the long ears of an ancestor figure. Whoever carved them was working in two traditions at once and clearly did not regard that as a contradiction. It is not a compromise imposed from outside, but a synthesis made by the islanders themselves, and it is a fair emblem of what happened to the culture. Not erased, not preserved in amber, but folded into something new that is still recognizably itself. That is what cultural survival actually looks like, as opposed to how it is usually imagined. Outsiders tend to want indigenous culture either intact and unchanged, which is a museum fantasy, or gone, which is a tragedy that requires nothing of anyone. What real survival looks like is messier. A language spoken with Spanish loanwords, a Catholic mass with ancestral carvings, a traditional festival with a modern sound system, tourism paying for the preservation of the sites that tourism endangers. It is compromised and alive, which is the only way anything is ever alive. Almost the whole rest of the island, the quarry, the platforms, Orongo, the gardens, the volcanoes, is empty of houses, which means the Rapa Nui live in one corner of their island and the ancestors have the rest of it. Most of the island is a national park, and since 2016, that park has been co-managed by the Rapa Nui community rather than administered solely from the mainland, which was the outcome of a long political struggle. The relationship with Chile has been difficult, and the history behind that is recent enough to matter. For most of the 20th century, the island was leased in its entirety to a sheep ranching company, with the Rapa Nui confined to the area around Hangaroa and effectively barred from the rest of their own island. They were not granted Chilean citizenship until 1966. Land rights, immigration from the mainland, and the limits of autonomy remain live political questions on the island today, and there have been protests and occupations over them within the last 2 decades. The statues have been coming back up. Almost all restoration is modern work. Ahu Akivi in the 1960s, Ahu Tongariki's 15 figures in the 1990s after the tsunami had scattered them, various others since. Standing a moai back on its platform is a serious engineering exercise, and each restoration is also a decision about how the island presents its own past. There are arguments on the island about how much should be raised and how much left as it fell, because the fallen state is also history, and the toppling was a real event that meant something. Restoring every statue would erase the record of the Huri moai as thoroughly as leaving them all down would erase the record of the ancestor cult. What has emerged in practice is a compromise. Some platforms restored, many left exactly as they are, and the fallen statues along the transport roads deliberately untouched, still lying where they came down on their way to the coast. And the culture is not a museum exhibit. The Rapa Nui language, a Polynesian language, is still spoken, though it is under real pressure from Spanish and is classified as endangered, with revitalization programs running in the schools. There is an annual festival, Tapati, in which the island's families compete in traditional arts, dance, carving, body painting, and physical contests, including a spectacular slide down a volcanic slope. There are working carvers. The carving tradition never entirely died. Wooden figures, ornaments, and small stone moai are made on the island today, some for the tourist trade and some for the community's own purposes, and there are families in which the skill has passed down continuously. The material is different and the market is different, but the hands doing it are descended from the hands at Rano Raraku, and some of the work is not for the market at all. When a moai is raised or a ceremonial occasion requires it, there are people who know the forms, and the knowledge of how these things should properly be done sits with families rather than with institutions. There are people who can trace their descent from the survivors of 1877. And there is a quiet detail in the island's demographics that carries the whole history in it. A substantial proportion of Rapa Nui people today live not on the island but in mainland, Chile and elsewhere, part of a diaspora created by a century in which the island could not support everyone and opportunity lay overseas. So the descendants of people who could not leave their island for 300 years now fly back and forth across the same ocean their ancestors crossed by canoe, and the community exists in two places at once, and the question of who belongs and who returns is a live one in island politics. That is the thing to hold on to against the parable. The story that the world tells has Easter Island ending. A dead civilization, silent statues, a warning. The island is not silent, and the people did not end. They were reduced to 111, and they are still there, on the same rock in the same ocean, arguing with a government about land and teaching their children a language and putting their ancestors back on their feet. There is a phrase used on the island, that the moai are not being restored so much as being helped to stand up again. And the difference in wording is the whole point. One is conservation work performed on objects. The other is something a family does for a relative. There is one moai that has become the focus of a long and unresolved argument, and it is not on the island. Its name is Ho Hakananaya, and it is generally considered one of the finest moai ever carved. Not tough like most of them, but hard basalt, smaller than the giants at around 2.5 tons, and unusually elaborate. On its back are carved birdman figures, birds, and ceremonial motifs, meaning it belongs to the moment when the old ancestor cult and the new birdman religion overlapped. It stood at Orongo, in a stone house on the crater rim, and it may have been the most important statue on the island at the time. Its name is usually translated as something like stolen friend or hidden friend, which has struck a great many people as unbearably apt given what happened to it, though the name appears to predate the removal. The carvings on its back are the key to its significance. 2 birdmen facing each other, a bird's head, ceremonial paddles, and other motifs of the Tangata Manu cult cut into a statue that belongs stylistically to the older ancestor tradition. It is, in other words, a physical record of the moment when one religious order was being overwritten by the next, an ancestor figure that was reinscribed with the new faith rather than being pulled down. There is nothing else quite like it. In 1868, the crew of a British naval vessel removed it. It was taken to England and presented to Queen Victoria, who passed it to the British Museum, where it stands today near the entrance to one of the main galleries, seen by millions of people a year. The Rapa Nui have asked for it back. In 2018, a delegation including the island's governor and community leaders travelled to London and met the museum's staff and stood in front of the statue, and there is footage of that meeting that is difficult to watch unmoved, people weeping, touching the figure, addressing it. Their argument was not primarily legal, nor was it new. Requests concerning the statue have been raised at intervals for many years, and the 2018 visit was the most public and most widely reported of them. The delegation brought a small carved figure to leave with the museum as a gesture, and asked, in the meeting, that the museum consider what it would mean for the statue to return, offering, in some accounts, to send a replacement carving of comparable quality in its place so that the London gallery would not stand empty. That offer tells you how the request was framed, not as a legal claim to property, but as a family asking for a relative to come home and volunteering to leave something in his chair. It was that the moai is not an artifact, but an ancestor, and that the distinction is not a metaphor or a poetic way of putting it, but the actual ontology of the object in Rapa Nui understanding, in which a carved figure of a forebear holds and channels that person's continuing presence, that the statue contains the spirit of a family member, that it has been away from its land and its people for 150 years, and that they would like it to come home. The governor's phrasing was widely reported, "You have our soul." The museum's position is the one it takes on all such claims, that the object is held lawfully, that it is seen by a global audience, that it is well cared for, and that these questions are complex. Some form of ongoing dialogue continues, loan arrangements have been discussed. The statue is still in London. There is a reasonable case on both sides of the general question of museum repatriation, and this is not the night to settle it. But this particular case has features that make it unusually stark. The object was taken by a naval crew from a colonized island 6 years after slave raids had reduced its population catastrophically. The community that wants it back is not hypothetical or extinct. It is a few thousand people who can name the lineage and the site. And the thing they are asking for is not a vase or a coin, but a representation of a specific ancestor from a culture whose entire relationship with such objects is that they are inhabited. Whatever one concludes, the situation contains the whole history of this island in miniature, something of enormous value, taken during a period of maximum vulnerability, now serving an audience of millions on the other side of the world while the people it belongs to look at photographs. It is not the only one abroad. Moai and moai fragments sit in collections in Paris, Brussels, Washington, Santiago and elsewhere, taken at various points across the 19th and 20th centuries. A scattering of ancestors distributed around the museums of the world. Some have moved. In recent years, a moai held in a Chilean mainland museum was returned to the island, and the homecoming was marked with ceremony and considerable emotion. Watching how the island received it tells you what these objects are to the people they belong to. The statue was met at the airport. There were speeches and chants and a great many people, and the reception was not the reception of an artifact arriving at a museum, but of a person coming home after a very long absence. That is the register in which these conversations happen on the island, and it is a different register from the one used in the institutions that hold the others. That case was simpler, since both parties were within one country. The others remain where they are, and the conversations continue at the slow pace such conversations always take. Step back from the arguments now. The collapse debate, the repatriation question, the archaeology. And remember the ordinary people, because everything on that island was made by individuals whose names are gone. There was a carver at Rano Raraku who spent a substantial portion of his working life on a single statue. He knew the rock the way a woodworker knows grain, where it would split cleanly, where a flaw ran, how deep to cut before the shape emerged. He held a basalt pick in his hands for hours a day for years. His hands would have been unmistakable, calloused in specific places, probably arthritic by middle age. He would have known the sound the rock makes when it is about to flake wrong. He would have had apprentices, and been short with them, and taught them anyway. Somewhere on that slope is a statue he spent years of his life on, and tonight it is either standing on a platform by the sea, or lying face down in the grass where it fell on the road, or still half emerged from the rock exactly as he left it. His hands would have been unmistakable, calloused in specific places, probably arthritic by middle age. He was as real as you are. There was a navigator, generations earlier, who held in memory the rising points of dozens of stars and the feel of 4 different swells through the hull of a canoe, who had begun learning as a child by lying in the bottom of a boat while an older relative named the stars overhead in order, and who took a group of people out into an ocean where a mistake meant everyone died and found an island the size of a small city in a space larger than a continent. He carried an entire intellectual system in his head with no written notation of any kind. He would have been responsible, personally, for the lives of everyone in that canoe, for weeks, with no way to check whether he was right until land appeared or did not. There is no modern profession that carries quite that combination of technical precision and personal consequence. He was as real as you are. There was a woman who built rock gardens, who broke volcanic stone and carried it and set it around her plantings, who knew which slopes held moisture and which the wind scoured, whose knowledge of that soil was hard-won and specific, and taught to her by someone who had learned it the same way. Her work covered more of the island than all the statues, and nobody has ever made a documentary about her. There was also a chief who had to decide, in some year we cannot name, whether his lineage would attempt a larger statue than the one their neighbours had just raised. Knowing what it would cost in labour and food, knowing what backing down would cost in standing, weighing it the way people in charge have always weighed such things. There was a young man who swam a channel with sharks in it for the honour of his lineage, and waited weeks on a bare rock islet for a bird to lay an egg. He would have been chosen for it, and would have known what the choosing meant, and would have been afraid at the top of the cliff and gone down anyway. There were others waiting on that islet with him from rival families, sleeping in caves on bare rock with the sea all around, watching the sky for turns. Some of them did not come back. The tradition remembers men lost in the channel. And there was somebody, in the 1860s, who watched ships come into the bay and understood too late what they were, and who lost their family in a week. And somebody in 1877 who was one of 111 people, standing on an island that had held thousands, and who decided to keep going anyway, and from whom people now living are descended. Somebody, in the years after, chose to keep speaking the language to their children when it would have been easier not to. Somebody remembered the chance. Somebody, generations later, stood in front of a Chilean official and argued about land, and somebody after that flew to London and spoke to a statue in a museum gallery. It is one continuous line of people, and it has not broken once. They were us. Not a parable, not a warning, not a case study in resource management. People with a full interior life each, doing difficult things well under conditions of extraordinary isolation, and enduring something terrible that they did not cause. The statues are the famous part. The rest of it is the actual story. And it is worth saying that the ordinary work was not drudgery imposed on people by an obsession with stone. A society that spends 5 centuries carving ancestors is a society whose ordinary people wanted the ancestors carved. The way medieval villagers wanted a cathedral, the way people everywhere have poured surplus into the things that gave their lives shape and standing. The carver at Rano Raraku was not a slave to a cult. He was doing skilled work that his community valued for his family's ancestors on the most important project his island had, and he was probably proud of it. So if Easter Island is not the parable, what is it? It would be a shame to spend a night dismantling a lesson and put nothing in its place, and in fact the honest history has more to offer than the myth did. The first lesson is about how environmental damage actually happens, and it is less flattering to our capacity for foresight than the parable. In the parable, people knowingly consume their way to disaster, which implies the solution is simply to know better. What appears to have happened on Rapa Nui is subtler and more frightening. An invasive species arrived unnoticed on the founding canoe and quietly ended the forest's ability to regenerate, in a process that would have been invisible for decades. Because a woodland with no seedlings looks perfectly healthy until the mature trees begin to die, and by the time the trend is obvious, it has been irreversible for a generation. Nobody on that island could have detected it with the tools available. To notice it, you would need to compare seedling density across decades and connect that to an animal that comes out mostly at night and eats things lying on the ground in a forest. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure that would defeat any pre-scientific society and most modern individuals. The mechanism was only identified in the late 20th century by researchers with radiocarbon dating, sediment cores, and thousands of preserved gnawed palm nuts to compare. That is the harder and more useful warning. The damage that gets you is often the kind you cannot see happening, caused by something you did not know you had brought. And the rat is not an exotic case. It is the ordinary mechanism of ecological catastrophe on islands worldwide, and it has repeated itself everywhere humans have gone with animals in the hold. Rats, cats, goats, pigs, snakes, arriving unnoticed and dismantling systems that had evolved for millions of years without them. New Zealand lost most of its bird fauna this way. Hawaii lost most of its. Guam lost nearly all of its to a single introduced snake within living memory. The Rapa Nui, arriving around 1200 with rats in the canoe, were doing what every colonizing group on Earth did, with the knowledge available to everyone on Earth at the time, which was none. The second lesson is about adaptation, and it is genuinely hopeful. Faced with a landscape degrading under them, the Rapa Nui did not simply die. They re-engineered their agriculture across a tenth of their island, developed lithic mulching and walled gardens, reorganized their religion, and replaced a hereditary political order with an annual competitive one that redistributed authority peacefully. They kept a stable population going on a small, cooling, treeless rock in the middle of the Pacific for generations. Consider the counterfactual that the parable never asks. If the Rapa Nui had truly been incompetent stewards, the island would have been abandoned or depopulated long before 1722, and Roggeveen would have found ruins and nobody home, which is what actually happened on several other Pacific islands that were settled and later given up. Pitcairn itself is the clearest case. Polynesians settled it, lived there for centuries, and were gone before Europeans arrived, leaving stone tools and carvings and no people at all. Henderson Island nearby tells the same story. Those islands failed. Rapa Nui, which is smaller in resources than either in several respects and far more isolated than both, did not. Instead, he found a functioning society with cultivated fields, standing monuments, and thousands of people. The Rapa Nui did not merely avoid extinction on the hardest island in Polynesia. They were still there, 5 centuries in, when the outside world finally arrived. And they did it without any of the advantages that societies elsewhere use to weather bad centuries. There was no trade to fall back on, because there was nobody to trade with. There was no migration valve, because there was nowhere to go and eventually nothing to go in. There was no possibility of conquest, of expanding into a neighbor's territory, of importing food in a bad year, of appealing to an ally. Every solution had to be generated internally, from the resources of one small island, by a few thousand people. Most societies that face environmental degradation have options that the Rapa Nui simply did not have, and many of those societies did considerably worse. If you are looking for evidence that human societies can respond intelligently to environmental change, it is lying all over that island in the form of rocks that nobody photographs. The third lesson is the one the parable actively obscures, and it is about vulnerability. The Rapa Nui survived what they could survive. What they could not survive was contact, disease against which they had no defense, slave ships, the seizure of their land. The catastrophe came from outside, from a world with better boats, and it took 15 years to reduce them to 111 people. The most dangerous thing that ever happened to the most isolated society on Earth was the arrival of everyone else. That pattern is not particular to Rapa Nui, which is why it is worth stating plainly rather than treating as a local tragedy. Across the Pacific, across the Americas, across Australia and the Caribbean, the demographic catastrophe of the colonial centuries followed the same sequence. Introduced disease into populations with no immunity, followed by labor extraction, followed by land seizure, with mortality figures that are difficult to state without sounding hyperbolic. Rapa Nui's story is unusually stark only because the island is small enough that you can count the survivors, 111, and unusually distorted because a parable was built on top of it that assigns the blame internally. And the fourth, which is perhaps the deepest, be extremely careful about the stories you tell concerning other people's ancestors, because those stories do work in the world. They shape how a place is governed, how its people are treated by administrators and tourists and journalists, what gets funded, whose account is believed when there is a dispute. A narrative that presents a people as the authors of their own ruin is not neutral background information. It is a standing argument about their competence, deployed every time somebody has to decide whether they can be trusted to manage their own island. The collapse narrative was assembled by intelligent, well-meaning people from partial evidence, and it took hold because it was useful and dramatic and confirmed something the tellers already believed. It has been taught for half a century. It is largely wrong, and the people it is about have been saying so and not being heard, which is the same failure, in a different register, as 2 centuries of dismissing their account of how the statues moved, which, given that this island's other great scholarly correction came from finally listening to islanders describe how the statues walked, is a pattern worth noticing. There is a coda to this story that deserves telling, because it is one of the more remarkable acts of cultural recovery of the last century. The knowledge of traditional Polynesian navigation, the star compass, the swell patterns, the whole system that found Rapa Nui, very nearly died. Its loss would have been irreversible in a way that is hard to convey. This was not information written in books that could be rediscovered in an archive. It existed only in trained minds, transmitted by apprenticeship over decades, and when the last person who held it died without teaching anyone, it would have been gone permanently. The whole intellectual system, the accumulated observation of 1,000 years of ocean, unrecoverable by any amount of later scholarship. Written cultures forget things and then find them again. Oral cultures get one chance, which is also the answer to a question people sometimes ask about the Pacific. Why did these extraordinary navigators never write anything down? The answer is that they had a transmission system that worked perfectly well for 1,000 years and required no writing. Apprenticeship, chant, and constant practical testing against the ocean. It was robust to everything except a sudden break in the chain of teaching, and for 1,000 years nothing broke it. Then, in a single century, colonization did. Colonization, missionization, and the arrival of European instruments pushed it out of use across most of the Pacific over the 19th and 20th centuries. By the middle of the 20th century, the tradition survived in only a handful of places, most notably on a few small islands in Micronesia, held by a small number of elderly navigators. It was one generation from disappearing. The reason it survived at all in Micronesia is a small accident of history. Those islands were remote and poor enough that colonial administration sat lightly on them, and the canoes remained genuinely necessary for inter-island travel long after they had become ornamental elsewhere. Practicality preserved what prestige could not. And then it was rescued, deliberately, by people who understood what was about to be lost. In the 1970s, as we saw, Hawaiians building the voyaging canoe Hokulea found Maupialug on Satawal, one of the last fully trained traditional navigators, and he agreed to guide the canoe to Tahiti, and then, in a decision that broke with the custom of teaching only within one's own community, he agreed to teach. He trained Hawaiian navigators. Those navigators trained others. The knowledge spread back out across the Pacific, and voyaging societies were founded in island after island, and canoes were built. Hokulea has now sailed more than 200,000 nautical miles, including a circumnavigation of the globe, navigated without instruments. Traditional canoes have made voyages between island groups that had not seen such a passage in centuries, and the training is not a performance. A modern apprentice navigator learns the same star compass, the same swell reading, the same bird and cloud signs, and is expected to bring a canoe with a crew aboard to a real island across real ocean without instruments, which means the knowledge is being tested against the Pacific every time, exactly as it always was. Several of the navigators now practicing were taught by people taught by Mao, and they in turn are teaching teenagers. The chain has been repaired and is running again. And in 1999, a voyaging canoe sailed to Rapa Nui itself, the hardest target in the Pacific, a small island upwind at the far edge of the world, and found it, by star and swell, exactly as the first canoe had. Think about what that means. The knowledge that brought people to this island was carried by memory alone, was nearly extinguished by contact with the outside world, was preserved by a handful of old men on a tiny island thousands of kilometers away, and has now been brought back and used to sail to Rapa Nui again. Maupialug himself understood exactly what he was doing when he broke with custom to teach outsiders. He had watched the tradition die around him. Young men on his own island going to work in the cash economy, the apprenticeships lapsing, the chants going unlearned, and he judged that a tradition preserved exclusively and lost was worth less than a tradition shared and continued. He trained a generation of Hawaiians, and later trained more at home, and lived long enough to see voyaging canoes sailing all across the Pacific again. There are now navigators in a dozen island nations who can trace their training back to him, and through him to a line of teachers stretching back beyond memory. The thread was down to a few strands, and it did not break. That is the counterweight to everything hard in this story. The forest is gone, and will not return. The palm is extinct. There are attempts at reforestation on the island now, with introduced species, and stands of eucalyptus and other trees have been established in places. But the palm that made the original woodland is gone from the world entirely, known only from pollen, root casts in the volcanic soil, and those gnawed nuts. Nobody has ever photographed one. The tree that covered the island for hundreds of thousands of years was identified and named by science only after it had ceased to exist. The tablets cannot be read. The 111 were 111. But the language is still spoken. The statues are standing again. The island is governed increasingly by its own people, and the navigational tradition that found the place in the first instance is alive and being taught to teenagers. Some things end. Not everything does. The palm is gone, and the tablets are silent, and the 111 were 111. And the language is spoken. The statues are standing. The canoes are sailing. And the island is being governed increasingly by the people whose ancestors are buried in its platforms. Both halves of that are true at once, which is the ordinary condition of history and only feels strange because parables do not allow it. And that is worth carrying, because the parable's real damage was in the ending it assigned. A story that concludes with a dead civilization and silent statues invites the listener to close the book. The actual story does not close. There are people on that island tonight who are the direct descendants of the carvers and the navigators and the 111, living in houses within sight of platforms their own families built, teaching their children the language, standing their ancestors back up, and disagreeing publicly with the version of themselves that the world has been repeating for 50 years. That is not an ending. That is an ongoing argument between a small people and a large world about who gets to narrate a history, and it is being conducted, at the moment, with far more patience on one side than the other. And now our long night on the loneliest island in the world draws to its close, and it is time to set all of it down and let yourself sink towards sleep. There is nothing left to carry, no verdict to keep, no argument to settle. The story has been told. Everything is where it was. The quarry on the eastern slope with its 400 unfinished ancestors, the platforms around the coast, the rocks lying across the gardens, the crater rim at Orongo with the birdman cut into the stone, the statue in London, the people asleep tonight in Hangaroa with the surf going on the other side of the wall. None of it requires anything from you now. Let it settle now, softly, the way volcanic dust settles on a carving bed at the end of a working day. Let it go. The canoe coming over the horizon after weeks of empty water, the palms on the slopes, the birds that were not afraid. Let it go. The quarry and the stone picks, and the 400 ancestors lying half-emerged in the rock, the walking statues rocking their way along the roads, the coral eyes going into the sockets for the first time, and the ancestor beginning to see. Let it drift away. The rock gardens and the birdman swimming the channel and the ships in the bay and the long, hard century that followed. You do not need to hold any of it. Let it settle and dim and sink into the deep quiet where all the ages go. You do not have to decide tonight what happened to that island, or who was right about it, or what it means. The argument has been running for 300 years, and it will still be there in the morning without any help from you. Let it go the way the carvers let go of the day's work at dusk, setting the tools down at the foot of the rock face and walking home in the last light. Feel how far away that island is from you now, and how safe you are here. 2,000 kilometers of open ocean in every direction, and everyone who ever lived on that rock has long since lain down, exactly as you are lying down now, and let the day go and closed their eyes. The navigator who found it, the carver with the ruined hands, the woman who built the gardens, the swimmer on the islet waiting for the egg, the 111 who kept going. Every one of them slept, at the end of every day, with the sound of that same surf coming up from the black rocks under those same enormous southern stars. They lay down in stone houses and in thatched huts shaped like upturned boats, with the wind working at the roof and the sea sounding a few hundred meters away, and let the day go and slept exactly as you are about to. Whatever they had built or lost that day. A statue moved, a garden walled, a family fed, a bird waited for. They set it down at nightfall the way people always have, and closed their eyes on the loneliest island in the world. Rest now, traveller. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let the weight of the day, and the weight of all those centuries, settle and release. There is nothing to finish and nothing to solve. The arguments about that island will go on without you tonight, as they have for 300 years, and they will keep perfectly well until morning. Nothing depends on you tonight. The island has been arguing its own case for a very long time, and will still be arguing it when you wake. The statues are standing in the dark along the coast with their backs to the sea, facing inland, watching over the people they were made for, as they have all along. At Tongariki, the 15 of them stand in their line with the volcano behind and the whole Pacific in front, and when the sun comes up out of the ocean tomorrow, it will rise behind them and throw their shadows inland toward the island, the way it has done every morning since they were raised, and through all the centuries when they were lying face down in the grass, and every morning since they were stood back up. Sleep now. The island is quiet. The surf is working at the rock the way it has for 1,000,000 years, and the wind is moving over the grass and the scattered stones of the gardens, and the great southern sky is turning slowly overhead. Out at the eastern end, the long slope of Rano Raraku stands dark against the stars with its unfinished ancestors lying in the grass where the carvers left them, and the crater lake at Rano Kau lies black and still, and along the whole coast the standing figures keep their watch. The carvers put down their tools a long time ago. The ancestors are keeping watch. And everything that was ever built or lost or endured out there in the middle of that enormous ocean has passed into the same soft dark that is closing over you now. The voyage and the arrival, the palms and the birds, the quarry and the walking giants, the gardens and the swimmer and the ships and the 111. All of it has gone quiet out there under the same stars, and none of it needs anything from you tonight. Let it carry you down, gently, into sleep. Sleep well. Traveller, good night.